Hello and welcome to Purely Academic, your potentially educational podcast for the month of April 2025. I'm Dr. Jonathan Lack.
And I'm Sean Chapman.
All right, Sean, it is time for our main topic this month, and this is a topic that you picked, and it is basically the most English teacher topic you could have picked, because It is, this month, the 100th anniversary of a book we all had to read in school. What is that book, Sean?
It is The Great Gatsby, it's The Great Gatsby, because it is a book called The Great Gatsby, and it is also a great book. And yes, it is a book that is one of the most ubiquitous books in all of high school English. I have taught it twice when I was doing 10 honors at my previous school. I do 9th grade English now, and English is a second language, so I do not teach The Great Gatsby to them, because that would be a poor choice for a book there. This is a book that I think is... I both really love the book, but it's also obviously a book that is just like so deeply ingrained in American pop culture, partially because it's a book that like everybody has read, some more willingly than others. And when I was thinking about topics and I was looking at like, well, I wonder if there's like an anniversary or something coming up. And I was Googling around. I'm like, shit, it's the 100-year anniversary of The Great Gatsby. Well, there's only one time you have an opportunity to do a podcast on the 100-year anniversary of The Great Gatsby. And I'm a high school English teacher, and I felt like they would take my certificate away if I didn't take this opportunity. So let's talk about not just The Great Gatsby, but also the two of the movies, because one of my fascinations with this is I feel like this is a book that, in my opinion, would not be that big of a leap to turn into a movie. And yet somehow both versions are very bad, or like it's more than two versions, but the two sort of like primary versions people think of, the 1970s one and the 2010s one, are both bad movies in like exact opposite ways of each other. And it's just kind of fascinates me that somehow nobody has actually made a good Great Gatsby movie. And it's a thing that's fascinated me for a long time since I started teaching the book, because I want to have a really good Great Gatsby movie, and I don't. And so that was another thing I wanted to talk with you today, because you are, a movie guy. So
yeah, this is
like, it would be fun.
This is funny, because I agree that it's a great book, and I think if you haven't read it since high school and you maybe thought it was kind of old and stuffy in high school for whatever reason, or just whenever you read a book in high school you kind of wind up resenting it because it's something you're being forced to read, go back and read it. It's calling it a novel is actually maybe overdoing it. It's like a novella. It's very short. Yes. You could read it in 1-2 sittings. It's a little tiny book. And it is a beautiful book. It's very, very good. It's, perpetually relevant. I think it's something that... It's one of many high school English books I think are kind of wasted on high schoolers, because you're not really old enough to know why it's good yet. And I think reading it as an adult is really cool. I'm coming into this conversation, though, as a giant fucking grump, because you made us watch two movies, the 74 and the 2013. And here's the thing. I would have gone into this conversation saying the 2013 was a bad movie. I will no longer say that, because the 1974 movie has completely readjusted my barometer of what a bad movie is. Like, if we haven't done this since like the early days of the Weekly Stuff podcast, a like top 10 worst movies ever list, it would be on there for me. I think that is one of the absolute worst, most inept, most unwatchable pieces of shit I've ever watched. And in comparison, the 2013 movie, which, like, knows how to be a movie. It knows how to let its actors act. It knows how to cut a scene and move the camera and, like, tell a story visually. I don't think that, like, makes it great or anything, but it's competent in a way that, like, you don't appreciate until you see something that is so sub-competent. And, like, it's amazing to me. And in both cases... It's just, I think like the biggest failing of both at the end of the day is just the script. It's like people who have to write a Great Gatsby adaptation trip so hard over the text of the book itself that I think like they're completely unable to make a movie out of it. And it's funny because the week we're recording this, Sean, I'm putting the finishing touches on a lecture for my intro to film class where we're talking about adaptation. And we're talking about adapting a book to film. This was not planned when you introduced this topic, but it's been on my mind. And I'm doing a little like case study for them with the Lord of the Rings movies. And I'm just, one of the things I did is I just took the table of contents of Lord of the Rings and I showed how Peter Jackson rearranged it. And like, you see how much work went into thinking about like, okay, adaptation is more translation than it is staging. And how do we translate this text to cinematic form? And you look at that and think of how much work went into figuring out how to take Tolkien language and turn it into film language, and that is such a complicated thing. And the Great Gatsby adaptations are so married to the text in such weird, slavish ways that they are like unable to make that effort. Like there's no real effort to translate. And I think that's the biggest problem with like every adaptation of this book.
Yeah, and I don't like either of the movies. I don't think I have the same level of sort of spite for the 1970s one. I think partially I find it incapable for me to just watch these movies as movies, partially because of the English teacher-ness of it.
Yeah.
That I cannot see these movies other than as like teaching instruments, because neither of them are good enough to rise to the level of me actually caring to invest in them as films. But I do think they're very fascinating to me, because I think you're right. They're like so kind of obsessed with like really particular details of the writing. Both of them have lots of narration in them that often is edited in very strange ways, particularly the editing for the 2013 narration. I just always find very funny, because it feels like they always cut out the actual best part of whatever thing they're trying to put in and have Tobey Maguire say. But they also make like what are subtle, but I think really vital changes to things when they insert new stuff. That is always when they change something, I'm like, well, this is like the worst thing you could have changed. And it's like The Great Gatsby is not The Lord of the Rings. It is not some huge, gigantic, complex, 3-part novel that has so many different characters and locations and digressions and subplots and things that you have to go through a tremendous effort to edit it. Like The Great Gatsby is a movie-sized book. You don't have to make lots of essential changes to the plot.
But it's not a movie-shaped book. Like you do have to make like you have to make like here's my grand thesis. At the point where you have the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg over the Valley of Ashes, and you have made a set, and you are showing us that image, and you have an actor as Nick reading about the Valley of Ashes and T.J. Eckleburg to us over that image, you failed, and you should just pack it up and move on. Yes. You have not tried to make a movie. You are making an illustrated audiobook, and it's pointless. It's utterly pointless for you to make a set and then also have him go, do you see the eyes? They're right there, and they're fuck off. That's not how you make a movie. It's just not. And like that's my overall like. That's the thing, is that like if that's what I mean by tripping over it. They're like, well, if we have to include the narration by Nick where he talks about the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg. No, you don't. No, you don't. You're making a movie. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote that because he wasn't making something pictorial. He was making a book. And like that's where this is like a frustration for me with adaptations, and when people are always talking about like it needs to be faithful, and I'm like, no, it actually needs to be like 99 times out of 100 less faithful. That's like in a weird way.
Yes, well, because you can just as you say, you can just show the billboard. Like you can have the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg there. You could just show them, and then you can move on. And have it be an element of the set, and you can move on with your life.
There's a reason the paperback of The Great Gatsby with the iconic cover art with the eyes doesn't have a little button you press that reads that part out to you so you know what you're looking at, because it's a picture. You don't need the words. It's a picture. Sorry. Absolutely. I'm worked up about this, and we should probably start with the book so we can at least level set on why it's worth talking about at all, because from the movies, you would never know that this is a great book. You would never know that this is like a classic from those movies.
Yeah, so I've put together some brief notes. So let me go over my notes that leads us to the book, and then I kind of want to talk about like kind of our history with it, particularly as I'm curious for you, Jonathan. I assume you haven't read it since high school, right?
No, I read it when the 2013 movie came out, because I reviewed it, and I was at the press screening for that. So I would have like seen this in 3D and all the bells and whistles.
Oh my God.
And yeah, I think part of my disappointment at the time was I had just read the book, and then I see the movie and I'm like, stop reading the book to me. I've read it. Just show me. Because when you do, actually, that movie works pretty well when it just shuts up and lets the visuals do the talking. I'm good at that. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So let me go through the notes, and then we'll talk about kind of our relationship to the book and kind of what we noticed on this read through. So these are brief notes, because if I went too far in, like there's either you give very brief notes or you write a book on the history of The Great Gatsby. So here's some brief notes on F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author, and Great Gatsby. So our author here Francis Scott Fitzgerald, he was born in 1896 to a middle-class family in Minnesota. He is coincidentally named after his ancestor, Francis Scott Key, who is the guy who wrote the national anthem. So there's your little Francis Scott Fitzgerald trivia there. At 18 years old, he fell in love with, and began a relationship with Ginevra King, who was a rich Chicago socialite. And if there's anything you need to know about F. Scott Fitzgerald, it's that he had this relationship with Ginevra King, because this is what every single thing he ever wrote about is in some way centered upon this one failed relationship. So he had this relationship, right? She was 16, he was 18. She was very, very rich. He was not. And so their relationship ultimately ended because of that class divide between them. With Fitzgerald later accounting, this is a very famous thing, him recounting that King's father told him that poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls. That's like a direct quote that Fitzgerald wrote at one point. That line is not actually present in the book, but it is present, and I thought this was interesting, in both of the movies. So that's how famous this anecdote is that both movies thought to insert that line somewhere in there. So any Fitzgerald historian is obviously like looking at this moment as kind of like the genesis of him as an author, because this is what, again, basically everything he writes about connects in some way to Ginevra King, because obviously all those details in my first two bullet points, you can identify very clear parallels to different characters in The Great Gatsby. So as a result of him failing with this relationship with King, he fell into an intense depression, and he decided to join the army during World War I. And he was coincidentally stationed under a very young Dwight Eisenhower, who was a captain at that point, which is just another very weird historical detail. This is obviously well before he would be like the commanding general in World War II. Fitzgerald joined the war in order to die. Basically, he wanted to commit like a noble form of suicide, to join the war, die for his tragic love. And that did not work out. He survived the war, obviously. And during that process, as part of his kind of like noble suicide thing he was on, he wanted to get a manuscript published. So he had written a novel that he titled at that point The Romantic Egoist. And he wanted to get that manuscript published and then basically die in the war. He did not die, and the manuscript at that point was not published, and so he kind of put it on the back burner. During World War I, he was stationed in Alabama, and at that point, he met the other really important woman in his life, if you know anything about F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is Zelda Sayre, better known now as Zelda Fitzgerald, because they, of course, later married. She was, like King, a very rich socialite, because F. Scott Fitzgerald was a man who did not learn anything from the mistakes in his life. And so he eventually heard of Ginevra King's marriage. She got married to a very rich guy who obviously has lots of parallels to Don Buchanan in the book, The Great Gatsby. And so after learning of Ginevra King's marriage, he decided to get into a proper relationship with Zelda. That relationship eventually led to their engagement, only on the condition of Fitzgerald gaining enough financial success that he would be able to support Zelda. So at that point, he's like, okay, I've got my mission. I failed in my one relationship with a rich socialite. I've now hooked up with a different one. Now I got to get money. So he's discharged in 1919. He moves to New York City to pursue his career as a writer. His relationship with Zelda was very difficult. That's a thing you could just put at any stage in their relationship, that sentence. But he ultimately reworked his old manuscript into a debut novel, which is his novel, This Side of Paradise. That novel was a huge, massive, gigantic success. It immediately catapulted Fitzgerald to incredible literary fame and fortune, basically overnight. It's like one of the most popular novels of the 1920s. It's one of like the defining novels of the 1920s, though it's not as read today. Nowadays, Great Gatsby has totally eclipsed this. But back like pre-World War II, if you were talking about Fitzgerald, you would have been talking about This Side of Paradise, basically. That novel got him enough money that he gained substantial financial independence, and at that point, he married Zelda, and she became Zelda Fitzgerald. The Fitzgeralds then became infamous fixtures of New York City in the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age, coincidentally, is a term that is partially popularized by Fitzgerald in his short story collection, Tales of the Jazz Age. He didn't invent it, but that short story collection, like The Side of Paradise, was very popular, so it helped kind of contribute to this perception of what the Jazz Age was. They were both extreme alcoholics, F. Scott and Zelda, so they went to incredible parties in New York City. They engaged in ridiculous, rampant, reckless, and drunken behavior, which made them figures of national gossip. So they're very kind of famous for being these weird party socialites, the author Fitzgerald, and then the rich socialite girl, Zelda. Fitzgerald became acquainted with most of the rich and famous and wealthy people of the day, people from Hollywood, actors, directors. So when you're looking at the Great Gatsby party scenes and they're listing all these different kinds of people, there's the kinds of people that Fitzgerald became acquainted with at this time. He continued working as a novelist, putting out his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, in 1922. I've never read that one. I feel like that one has just kind of like been forgotten basically in time. It was not as successful as The Side of Paradise. And then his third, and today obviously most famous novel, is The Great Gatsby, and that was published in 1925, April 1925.
Sean,
so I'm not
do you know...
Yes.
I'm curious as a teacher,
Yes.
Do you know if when he wrote The Great Gatsby, the manuscript was just called Gatsby, and then right before sending it off to the printer, he took a fountain pen and scribbled The Great over it? Or is that just in the movie?
I believe that's an invention of the movie,
Okay.
Because it is the goofiest fucking thing. I forget, I don't think I have it in my notes. It did have a different title, obviously, at one point. Then he changed it to The Great Gatsby. That's not it, but it was not just Gatsby. It was something else.
I'll look that up while you're talking.
Yes. So I'm not going to go through, like, point by point everything that happened to him after The Great Gatsby, but just a couple of things of, like, the brief what happened to Fitzgerald past that point. So F. Scott and Zelda's relationship is absolutely infamous. It's like one of the iconic sort of like dysfunctional relationships in the history of literature. It was rife with jealousy, extreme depressive episodes on both sides. Both of them you'd maybe describe in the modern context as manic depressives, just based on the way they behaved. There's infidelity on both sides of the relationship, and it ultimately culminated in F. Scott getting Zelda institutionalized in the 1930s, because that's a thing you could fucking do back then with your wife, and it was fucked the fuck up. Zelda, coincidentally, was a writer herself, so she also published a novel. Her writing and her work was not really regarded much during her lifetime, but it did in the postmodern period have a big kind of reevaluation. I've never read her stuff, but it's kind of like interesting. It's one of those kind of interesting kind of like literary criticism pieces of looking at like that other side of a woman who in her day was kind of just regarded as hysterical and crazy. And then when you look back on it, you're like, oh, maybe there's like a lot of fucked up shit going on, especially if you're married to F. Scott Fitzgerald. He did not seem like a particularly pleasant person based on what most people said about him. Fitzgerald, in terms of literary history, he's considered part of a group of writers called the Lost Generation. They are writers who lived through, most of them also served, at least the men served in World War I, and they define that literary attitude we have of the post-war world where innocence has been lost. One of the other defining writers of the Lost Generation, probably the most defining writer from the American side of the Lost Generation, is Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway and Fitzgerald were very close friends. Depending on how much you want to read into things, they were maybe very, very, very close friends, if you catch my intimation there. But that's a whole discussion. Fitzgerald certainly had a sort of extreme fascination with Hemingway. I don't know how reciprocal that fascination was. But they were very close.
The book, The Great Gatsby, is very like open to queer readings in all sorts of ways.
Yes.
In ways that I think it's interesting the films, especially the Baz Luhrmann sands off, which I think is weird for Baz Luhrmann, given how queer a lot of his movies are, that it's kind of made so heteronormative. But like, I also think it's funny that Hemingway and Fitzgerald are kind of the two that like most people would know from this period. And even when I like told my was over at my mom's and her husband asked what we were doing for the podcast and I mentioned Great Gatsby, he said, is that Hemingway? Or I'm like, no, that's Fitzgerald. And he's like, I get them mixed up. And I always think that's funny because their writing style is like so diametrically different, because Hemingway is so direct and like, you know, obviously his whole style is known for that like very solid, direct, kind of to the point prose that is kind of staccato, and like Fitzgerald is flowery, long, descriptive. Like there's a lot less plot in The Great Gatsby than in a Hemingway book. It's just written very at length, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of it is also Hemingway actually like saw combat in World War I, and
Right.
Fitzgerald did not. I think that really touches their perspectives on that stuff. That Fitzgerald kind of stayed. He ultimately was in America. He was in this sort of weird depressive spiral for that whole time, and then Hemingway saw some shit that really affected him, obviously. But yes, they are the two probably most iconic male writers from America of the Lost Generation, and they do have kind of polar opposite writing styles. Fitzgerald is very flowery, lyrical. Ernest Hemingway is very sort of stoic. Is his whole thing. Fitzgerald's writing fell out of fashion with the beginning of the Great Depression. So after the 20s, there's obviously a huge cultural shift that happens because Fitzgerald's writing is so focused on the Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s, this age of excess wealth and basically excess everything. When you're in an era where nobody has excess anything, it becomes, even though it was critical of that era, Fitzgerald's writing, it is still seen as representing that era. And so his stuff got rejected pretty quickly in the 30s. So Fitzgerald struggled financially for the rest of his life at that point. He obviously, based on his behavior, was not particularly good with money. And so he had lots of money, but he spent all the money he had. I don't think he was a man who knew much about saving in financial planning. So he worked for a period in Hollywood as a screenwriter. And by all accounts, that period just totally crushed him spiritually and creatively. Like him trying to work within the studio system of the late 30s and early 40s just like destroyed the man. And although he was already given 2 periods of extreme depression throughout his whole life, he fell further and further into that depression and particularly into his alcoholism. And he ultimately died tragically very young at the age of 44 in the year 1940. And he considered himself at that point a failure. This is the classic author, like during his lifetime, sees brief success, spends most of his life actually in a period of failure where none of his stuff is getting published. People start critically panning his stuff. And then it's only posthumously that Fitzgerald is then brought back up again, which I'll talk about in a second. But that's sort of how Fitzgerald met the end of his life.
Well, that's a bummer.
Yeah, it's a big bummer. It happens a lot when you're reading about authors. I feel like that's not as much a movie director thing or whatever. Is like, oh, and then they got a couple of movies out, and then they spent the rest of their life as a drunk, and then they died or they killed themselves. Is how so many authors of the 20th century saw things go.
Hemingway committed suicide, right? But he was older. He was 61.
Yeah, Hemingway was older, but he did kill himself. So a couple of notes on Gatsby in particular of like, if Fitzgerald is considered a failure at the time of his death, how do we have Gatsby be what it is? At its release, Gatsby itself was a commercial failure, relative certainly to This Side of Paradise. I think relative to an average novel, it did fine. But if you're having like this huge debut success, The Great Gatsby was a very moderate thing at the point it was released. It had a very mixed critical reception, particularly compared to This Side of Paradise. There are contemporary reviews that hail it as great literature, but there were many that felt that it showed a deterioration in style compared to his previous books, which is the exact opposite of how people read those today. I think that This Side of Paradise is kind of clunky, and it's very, moralist in its like, it's just is trying to sort of like tell you all of its lessons. I think The Great Gatsby is much more explorative as a piece of work, which maybe is one of the reasons why it was rejected at its time, is you need to kind of apply a lot more to get out of what Gatsby gives you than This Side of Paradise. But the reputation of Gatsby tanked during the Great Depression alongside everything else, so it was already kind of seen as a little bit of a middling book, but it really tanked during the Great Depression. Gatsby's reputation only began being rehabilitated posthumously. So after Fitzgerald's death, his work was republished. And then vitally, The Great Gatsby was one of several novels that were distributed to American GIs in World War II. So like huge numbers of young men read The Great Gatsby during World War II because they were just given a choice of various books, and The Great Gatsby was one of those books. So the novel became extremely popular amongst many of the soldiers, and that surge in popularity helped motivate a broad critical reevaluation by 1944. By the 60s, The Great Gatsby continued to sell huge volumes of over 100,000 copies a year, and at that point was widely regarded as one of the great American novels. And then now, of course, today, The Great Gatsby has sold over 30 million copies and is taught in the vast majority of American high schools, and has just become a sort of like standard novel. And I could talk about why I think it is that standard novel in a little bit. But that's sort of how it gets brought back. So it's interesting to me that The Great Gatsby is only really found in that period of rediscovery, once everyone's reevaluating all of Fitzgerald's work. And at that point is when Great Gatsby kind of like rises amongst the rest and becomes by far his best regarded, most widely read novel today, which was not at all the case during his lifetime. And This Side of Paradise, some people read, like if you're interested in Fitzgerald, it's good to read. But his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, I don't know if I've ever met anyone who's read that book. Like it's just so obscure at this point. With Gatsby's popularity, it of course has been adapted many times to stage, TV, and film. The first film adaptation is actually a silent movie, which was released in 1926. That movie is now currently lost. Fitzgerald hated that movie very famously at that point. So,
Was that a full feature film or like a short? Do you
I
know?
don't know.
I
I
could look
didn't
that
jot
up.
that down. Yeah.
Let me look that up, because that's the thing with a lot of those kind of like lost literary adaptations, is sometimes they weren't like even full films. Okay, it was 80 minutes long. So like a 4-reeler. Interesting. Yeah. It was
Yeah.
based on a play which was directed by George Cukor, who is one of the major MGM directors. Like, he's one of the directors on Wizard of Oz. That's interesting, actually. So probably the play was better than the film.
Yes. And, it's very interesting to me that, that movie was released 1 year after the book. Obviously there's,
Yeah.
the production system is very different back then, but that's like that's unthinkable today. Couldn't imagine that happening today.
Okay, here's the funniest thing about this movie that I just learned. So I thought to myself, in both the 74 and 2013 film, when they got to Meyer Wolfsheim, I went, wow, it's amazing they haven't rethought this character, the like flagrantly anti-Semitic part of the book that like maybe needs an update. You know what the 1926 version did? Changed it to a white guy named Charles Wolfe and got rid of all that. So maybe in 1926, they knew that was wrong more than we know now. That's fucked up.
Yes, that is one of the things that's really shocking to me about both movies. It's like, I can accept Meyer Wolfsheim in the context of the 1920s with Scott Fitzgerald. All the people involved are dead. I can look past it. It's obviously horribly anti-Semitic, but it's
look past it in so much as like you understand it in the context, not saying it's okay. Yeah.
No, it's not okay, but it's like, it doesn't affect me today. It doesn't affect like 2025. But it is really weird when you put out a movie in 2013 and you're like, and he's Meyer Wolfsheim. Well, he's the guy who fixed the 1919 World Series. It's like, maybe you could like, at the very least, like change the name, change the accent.
Have him look less like monstrous and cartoonish, and maybe don't do the detail about the human molars he wears on his clothes and all that. It blew me away both times that both movies did that. And I'm like, guys, Jesus Christ, how did no one... Anyway, it's a whole thing.
And the 2013 one did change it. Instead of them being cufflinks, he just wears a human molar on his tie.
God.
It's totally different. Anyways, that's the first adaptation, is the silent film. I wish it wasn't lost. I'd be so fascinated to watch that. But unfortunately, you can't.
There's 1 minute of footage from the trailer that survives. You can go see that if you want.
Yeah, I don't think it's not quite as good as the whole movie, though.
No.
There was, following Gatsby's reevaluation of the 40s, a second film adaptation which came out in 1949. That is now a very obscure movie. It's necessarily not a lost movie. It's just like, I don't think a lot of people know about it. That one famously has just like changed most of the details of the plot, particularly because of like the censoring at that point at Hollywood Films. And so there's lots of things about the story of The Great Gatsby that the studio system did not approve of. And so if you look at the plot synopsis of that movie, I mean, it's just totally different. So we did not obviously watch that for today because we're already covering enough stuff, and I don't think there's really much point in bringing it up in discussion of the book. But then you have our two far more famous adaptations, which we'll talk about today: the 1974 movie directed by Jack Clayton and the 2013 movie directed by Baz Luhrmann. Neither of them are good.
All right. Well, we'll talk about the adaptations in a little bit. You wanted to talk about our history with this book?
Yeah, I'm curious, Jonathan, if you remember how you felt about it in high school, because we both read it in high school, and then have come back to it through different paths. You reread it in the lead up to that movie. I obviously kind of rediscovered it in my lead up to teaching because it was part of my licensure program. One of the like kind of major assignments of that was to create a mock unit based on The Great Gatsby, and that's when I kind of evaluated the book.
Yes. So I love that that's like it's like a flight simulator training situation for like a pilot. It's like, can you teach The Great Gatsby? We'll only license you if you can.
They did, Jonathan, they did The Great Gatsby and they did Romeo and Juliet. And I'm glad that they did because I've taught both of those multiple times. I've taught Romeo and Juliet. I'm coming up on now my 5th time teaching Romeo and Juliet in a couple of weeks here. So it's a very applicable mock unit.
Awesome. Well, anyway, so here's the thing, Sean. I have kept, because I started writing reviews and movie reviews and stuff at 10 years old, I have kept a rolling like archive of all my documents that I've like ever written for anything up to today. I found everything we did for Gatsby in high school. So we read this in Mrs. Hall's class in 10th grade, honors English. Yep. You and I were in the same class for that. And So we read it. Her assignments included 2 things where we had to summarize all of the chapters, just to, I think, make sure we were reading it. So I have my old chapter summaries. We did have to do an essay. From what I could tell, my essay was just about kind of, we were trying to go over the themes of like, what do the characters represent, and like the American dream, all that kind of basic stuff that you get out of The Great Gatsby, right? So one thing I can tell you is that I did actually read the book. And that's like actually, because I, in high school, maybe someone should have caught that I had roiling ADHD, but no one did. If I wasn't into something, I couldn't get through it. Like, I didn't, like, if I started a book in English class and I was not into it, I wasn't finishing it. I was just faking my way through it. Great Gatsby, I did clearly read the whole thing. I did like those chapter summaries were good. My essay clearly was informed. I went back and looked at it. So I was into it. And I was into it enough that, do you remember in that period, Sean, when we started making machinima movies?
Yes.
Machinima being the same process by which the Rooster Teeth classic Red vs. Blue was made in the Halo games. You and I did one based on John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath that I do still have, though will never see the light of day publicly.
Well, we did 2 for that class, because the first one was Lie versus Lay, a grammar analysis, which was so far above and beyond what anyone else did for that very minor assignment in retrospect.
Yes.
And then we did our much more our magnum opus, The Grapes of Wrath, an adaptation that will never see the light of day.
Which were all shot in Halo 3, would have been the game at the time. Because Halo 3 also opened up machinima to everyone because it had the camera mode and everything.
Yes.
So you could do a lot with it, and we did. It was fun. Do you remember, though, that we had another one in the works for The Great Gatsby?
I didn't remember. I remember that we had one for Romeo and Juliet that we were doing. I didn't remember Great Gatsby one, no.
We had one, and I still have the script. I still have the script. If you want to do a dramatic reading of it later on, we can. It's only about 10 pages. But here's the thing, Sean. You were saying earlier you didn't remember what the alternate title for The Great Gatsby was. I figured it out looking at this because my Great Gatsby script was split into chapters. It's like a Tarantino-esque out of chronological order story wherein Gatsby is an assassin and of course killing people because it's all in the Halo engine. So he's got to have a gun, so you had to adapt these things. And all the chapters are named after the alternate titles for The Great Gatsby that Fitzgerald wanted, which include Gold-Hatted Gatsby, Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires, Tremulchio in West Egg. That's the title he most wanted that he was denied. The High Bouncing Lover. That is the chapter in the film, my film, where Daisy is hit by a car and killed. I kind of put those 2 incidents with Myrtle and Daisy together and used the pun, the High Bouncing Lover. Let's see, chapter 4 was Under the Red, White, and Blue. That was another title he had. And On the Road to West Egg. So those were all of Fitzgerald's alternate titles. He never really liked The Great Gatsby. Zelda convinced him to use it, is what I'm reading here. But even when it was going to the press, he panicked, called his editor, please, can we call it Tremulchio and West Egg? And the editor had to talk him off the cliff and be like, dude, no one knows who Tremulchio is. The Great Gatsby will work. And I do think the editor was correct for that, because here's my hot take, I don't think this would be in high school English classes were it not for the alliteration in the title.
I mean, that helps. I mean, you can tell from his other titles, This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and Damned, and then The Great Gatsby. It stands out so much stylistically from those others. It's just a totally different approach to titling. But it's a much more marketable title than those other ones. I mean, I like both those titles just fine. This Side of Paradise, The Beautiful and Damned are fine. But The Great Gatsby, you just say it, you're like, yeah. Even if you have no idea what it's about, it just conjures an image in your head of a guy and he's great and his name's Gatsby. It's it seems probably pretty cool.
My favorite moment in my stupid fucking script is that the bad guy of the piece, who winds up killing Gatsby, is a character named Tremulchio, who we learn is actually Tom Buchanan, who has been transformed after Daisy is killed. Again, I kind of mixed Tom, Daisy, Myrtle, George Wilson, all that stuff. And so there's a moment where Tom swears vengeance, and he says, "One day, Gatsby, you'll have to answer to me for her death. I swear on her grave my vengeance. I shall kill you one day in her honor, but until that day you shall fear my name, for I am no longer Tom Buchanan. I am Tremulchio." And I do think what's funny is that is not appreciably goofier than several moments in the Baz Luhrmann film.
No. I think the only problem with that is that would be Tremulchio of East Egg.
Yes, that's true.
Not of
That's
West
true.
Egg. So if
Well,
I have
in
to
my
offer some criticism of 16-year-old Jonathan Lack, maybe didn't think it all the way through.
in my script, West Egg is a safe house that Nick, who is Gatsby's assassin handler, has built to try to keep Gatsby safe. But then Trimalchio breaks in and kills Gatsby, and Nick is very sad at the end.
It's just like, I wonder why I have purged this from my memory and I do not recall us doing, like, I mean, obviously this never got to the stage of us filming any part of it in Halo 3, so maybe it was a little more of a Jonathan has gone off the deep end, and it didn't fully enter my purview yet.
I have all the maps that we would have shot on specified in the script. I have the first scene, the prologue, is Gatsby doing a hit on a character named Owl Eyes, which is very funny. When I went back to the book, I'm like, Owl Eyes is the best fucking character in the book. I don't want to see Gatsby kill him. The Owl Eyes is great.
If anything, like, Owl Eyes should be the guy who's like, he should be like Ian McShane in the John Wick movies, you know? Like, That's who Owl Eyes is.
Well, John Wick, this is so old, Sean. John Wick didn't exist back when we were doing this, because we've lived lives.
Oh, if only now I'm just imagining a Great Gatsby John Wick mashup, and that does sound like a pretty great fucking movie.
All right. Well, anyway, that is my experience with Gatsby, because again, I searched, because now I keep all of my documents in cloud storage with Google Drive. So I just like went into Google Drive and searched Gatsby, and I found all this old stuff. So yeah, like I have my old Gatsby essay and everything. I submitted it on January 20th, 2009. I've got all this stuff.
Actually, yeah, I don't have anything that goes back that far unless I wrote it in Google Drive originally. So I've got like some stuff that's from like 11th grade, in which I think is when I started using some Google Drive stuff, and we used it for debate. But that's like so many computers ago, and I don't think I found a reason to to put it on a flash drive and bring it over, or put it on a hard drive at some point. I've got all my college stuff is when I, like, freshman year of college, when I started like sort of keeping everything together. I still have all of that, but that's all. No Gatsby in that. So I don't have anything from my high school days of like documents left over, but I definitely remember liking the book. I think it just helps that it's short. You know, it's one of the reasons why I like teaching it. It's like if you don't have enough time to despise it, in the way that any longer novel that you're on for, like, if it takes you more than 3 weeks to get through the book, it's just, I don't think, like, feasible for most English classes. Maybe if your AP, you can kind of do it. But yeah, like, so I definitely remember enjoying The Great Gatsby. But like, for me, getting into it properly was definitely coming to it at that program at MSU Denver, and them asking me to create a fake unit. I've got or mock unit. I've still got my copy of The Great Gatsby that has an insane number of post-it notes, because that was part of the thing, was, you know, creating like little like kind of activities for each chapter, even though you wouldn't actually do that in the class because that's a little excessive. And then at that point, I've like really kind of fell in love with the book. So I've read it many times now, probably almost once a year since then. Though the last time I taught it would have been actually a little bit ago, I guess. The last time I taught it would have been spring 2021. But yeah, like, I just think, like, for me, The Great Gatsby, it is both like a book I really enjoy, but I also do think it is a particularly good book to teach in high school. Like, I think the reason why it has risen to that ubiquity is not just because it is a, like, you know, canonical book, because there are lots of books that are canonical. But I'm not going to fucking teach Moby Dick to, you know, a bunch of high school kids at any level, really. Maybe AP seniors, you could maybe do parts of Moby Dick. But it's just like, there's lots of really great novels that just do not work in that context. But The Great Gatsby is perfect because it's short, so you can get through it quickly. You can get through it in a couple weeks easy and still get into a lot of the depth of the book. It's got high literary content, so you're getting, like, you know, lots of really great writing in front of them, even if they don't understand all of the writing. It's got really great vocabulary, so it's good at kind of introducing students to that kind of stuff. But it also is just like this perfect book for teaching specific concepts. The most obvious one, clearly the one that Baz Luhrmann understood because he can't shut the fuck up about it in his own movie, is the symbolism stuff. Right, because you've got your two very obvious self-conscious symbols that the book is aware of, that Nick is actively dissecting for the reader in the text of the book, to the extent where you almost struggle to call it normal symbolism because it's so self-apparent. But that's, of course, the green light that Gatsby's looking at in the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. But the thing that makes it great as a teacher is you can use that as the intro into, here are these symbols. They represent bigger ideas, right? The green light, it's Gatsby's longing. It's the longing for the American dream, for Daisy, for wealth, for all these things. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg and our eyes, of course, they represent like the eyes of God, watching over the world, watching like the sins of these people. And those are very obvious symbols that the book tells you about, but then you can upgrade to the deeper stuff because there's a lot more literary richness there with like the way that automobiles are used. The cars in the story are very symbolic in how they represent masculinity and wealth and power and these kinds of concepts, and having students chart out like at the end of the book, okay, what were like the major scenes involving cars, who were using the cars, who was driving the cars, who was doing repairs and fueling the cars, George Wilson, the poor guy, right? Like, it really helps illustrate the dynamics of all the characters and stuff like that. And that's the thing that makes it such a good book, is it's like, for specifically for high school English, it's a good book regardless. But for teaching it, it's like, here's all these great concepts. It has very obvious versions of the concepts, but it also has deeper, more complex versions that you have to dig into, that the book is not just actively explaining to you. So it's like, it's a book that in teacher terminology scaffolds itself. Scaffolding in pedagogy is building up to more complex concepts by using simple examples. And it's like the Great Gatsby, it is like F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote it for high school teachers in a weird way. And so it's such a good book to teach, but the shame about it is that I think so many people don't read it again as adults, because
Yes.
you said earlier that like when you're a teenager, you can't really understand the deeper parts of the book because you're 16 years old. It's like there are aspects of the novel that you're just not going to be able to crack without more life experience. And so it's always a shame that people don't come back to it when they're older, because when you do, I think you just see how resonant the themes of the book and how eternal a lot of those ideas are, and how much you can see parts of yourself in so many of the different characters, particularly Nick and Gatsby. And maybe if you're a rich bastard, you can see yourself in Tom and Daisy. But it's that thing where I think rereading the book multiple times over the years, I'm always struck by how just how well I think F. Scott Fitzgerald got at a pretty essential idea of what it is to live in America that has not fundamentally changed in 100 years, and in some ways just becomes more apparent the more fucking decrepit the country becomes. Like, there is, particularly with like the character of Tom Buchanan, it is just amazing to me how much that dude just doesn't. You could translate the novel to a contemporary setting in America and not change a single fucking thing, not change a line of dialogue about Tom Buchanan, and that character would play, and he just worked the exact same. Like, it's so crazy.
Not even just a line of dialogue, the way Fitzgerald writes about him. Like,
yeah.
I can I just read this one quote about how he describes Tom? Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. Fucking savage, fucking mic drop of a moment, and you are so right that, like, yes, you could just take that description and be like, yup, that's a lot of different kinds of assholes in America now who need to be fucking dealt with.
Yeah, I think you just look at, like, the way in which wealth and the power that wealth affords dominates so much of American society, American culture. It's definitely, right now we've got fucking Elon Musk, doing his awful shit. And there is just something about the story of this book that I think it is still very resonant. And then it's the characters of Nick and Gatsby that I just find so fascinating and compelling. These two men, both of them are like shadows or reflections of each other in so many ways. They're both reflections of the author in different ways. And of Gatsby, this guy who could be great, right? That's the trick of the novel, is that he isn't great as he exists currently. He has been turned into this very sad, kind of stupid guy who's chasing after things he can never get, who is a man who has a lot of potential, who could do lots of great things, as his dad tells you at the end of the book, who could have done so much, but he spends his whole life chasing after an illusion. And it's the tragedy of that story. And a thing that I think is just like an essential quality of the book is the essence of who Gatsby is as a character And the tragedy and the thing that's appealing about him, both to Nick and the reader, is a thing that the adaptations have never understood. It's the thing that's, I think, most essentially missing from both movies, is I think that they don't understand kind of like the core of the story and the core of Gatsby as a character, and that feeling of what he is, that he is both amazing and he's both kind of awful at the same time. And that's how Nick kind of always speaks of him in those terms. And the movies never understand the awfulness of Gatsby, I think. But yeah, I'm kind of rambling on it, but it's just a book that I think about those characters a lot, because of how much I think they resonate with the essential kind of American experience.
Well, and if I were to translate what you're saying to like my experience, because I don't teach books, but I teach films, right? And I think we just last month, we talked about Citizen Kane, right? Yeah. And that is like, I think the equivalent for like college film studies is like, and it's you teach it not just because it is so teachable, but because it is genuinely great, right? But it also, like, when you say it scaffolds itself, Citizen Kane scaffolds itself. Like, yes. It is a movie that just opens up all these layers without you having to do much work as a teacher at all. Like, you don't have to tease out Citizen Kane. It teases itself out for the students. And so I totally resonate with what you're saying there, and I think it's true of Gatsby. But I also, like, what did strike me going back to it is there's something, and I know Fitzgerald was not that old when he wrote it because he died young, so he couldn't have been that old, right? Yeah. But like, there is kind of an old man's quality to this book, of this like feeling that like everything's kind of failed. And there's this sense of like mourning and loss, and I think that's the biggest thing I would not have gotten as a kid with this book. Of that, and I think it's the thing that the movies don't get either. And I think is like, it's a cultural thing that cannot be overcome, is that at the end it's like, it's sad that romance between Gatsby and Daisy isn't real. It's not actual love. She is not a real person in his eyes or in his understanding. The real person she is pretty hollow and empty. She and Tom kind of deserve each other. And that, realizing that at the end, like, Nick is in a fucking state at the end. Like, he's describing leaving New York feeling like he's left almost like an emotional war zone. There's the idea that one of the titles was Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires, the idea that those things go together, that this is like an era of devastation. Like, I think there is a moral clarity to the book about what wealth does to the human soul, and what America in its like being constructed in the pursuit of wealth, what it does to the soul of the nation. It's so clear on that. And I think it resonates so much in 2025, 100 years later, in such kind of startling ways. That's where I felt like, man, this was to some degree wasted on me as a kid, because I think the real richness of it, I just no 16-year-old could get. No 16-year-old would have ever lived enough life to have understood what this book was actually talking about.
Yeah, well, I think, there's, at the end of chapter 7, which is the big turning point at the hotel room that ultimately leads to Myrtle's death, right? Like, a huge, like, kind of mic drop moment in that scene is after everything's gone to shit and Daisy and Gatsby have kind of stormed out and Tom's left behind and he gets the fucking bottle. He's like, hey, anyone want some of this? And then Nick just mutters to himself, no, I just remembered it's my birthday. I'm 30. Like, that mic drop of I'm 30 just I can't resonate with you when you're half that age, when you're 15 years old. But there's something about that moment of like, oh, it is this like, my youth is gone, that's like that stage of being like, a young adult, like that has kind of left. And it's this, like that sensation of, Gatsby has spent that entire time chasing after this foolish thing that he can't have, and if he gets it, it's not what he wants it to be. And that's so much the tragedy of his life, and you can only feel that when it's like, oh, the time has gone, the time has passed, and you only have so much of that. There's like a devastation to that realization of what like Gatsby's attempt to rebuild the past, as he insists he's doing, does, because it in the action of the novel, it very literally robs him of his future, but it more like broadly in a symbolic sense, it robs anyone of their future. That if you're chasing after these things that you wish you had, if you're chasing after the youth you didn't get to have, it means you are robbing yourself of all the things that you could have if you focused on the world you're actually living in. And that realization is, I think, very devastating to Nick, because I think he sees it in his own behavior too, in his traipsing around with Jordan Baker, in the sort of weird on-off relationship that's so ill-defined that gives him momentary comfort, but nothing like long-term. And he kind of sees like that there is nothing for him in the East. Like that moment is so powerful. And it's just, I think it's an emotion that a teenager is not at a stage in their life that they can actually like access.
I was going to mention that moment too, because I agree it's like startling now. Once you're past 30, that moment is such a mic drop. And you're right, because I think what the turning point is it's Nick realizing he is and has to be an adult. And he is surrounded by fucking children. He is surrounded by little children who can only see past like the ends of their own noses and cannot imagine other people as people. And that's all of them. That's Jordan, and it's Tom, and it's Daisy. Gatsby is the one who like is most human, but he has been so like he could be human, but he has been so warped by this that he too has been made childish. And I think that's what I got out of it. And that's this. And I think about that a lot now, because we are such a nation of selfish little children, you know, in America, of, you know, me, you know, I don't care who we fucking round up. I'm going to vote because my eggs are too expensive or whatever. You know, and there's such rampant selfishness as a virtue. And I think like that's obviously what Fitzgerald saw in the society as at the time. He was writing on the verge of the greatest economic disaster in the nation's history, so maybe we should all take that as a warning 100 years later, that when these themes resonate, maybe we're headed all for fucking disaster. But yeah, like, I think it just has its finger on the pulse of like a pathology that is so American.
Yeah, and it's like the imbuing of wealth itself with like an inherent like sort of like status worth, right? Like how many people look at Elon Musk and look at Donald Trump and say, well, they've got a lot of money. Even Donald Trump, though, that's a kind of questionable statement. But he at least appears to have lots of money. Therefore, he must be smart and powerful. He's got to be a great businessman. Like, how many people think that Donald Trump is a great businessman because of the image that wealth in his big fucking ostentatious towers and all that stuff projects? And there's just this, like, automatic association that wealth means that this person has done something, is themselves a person worthy of that wealth, which means they're better than me because I don't have that wealth. And that's such an insane fucking perspective on the world, particularly in like the modern America, or America in the 1920s as well, which is a country that had been around long enough for the wealth to calcify into the upper strata of society, and it has only calcified more and more and more as time has gone on. So these very wealthy people like Tom and Daisy, or like Trump and Musk, have not done things to earn their wealth. They were born with that wealth, and that being born with the wealth is the truest power in that way. Like, that's the thing that separates a Gatsby. That Gatsby can never be like them, because he's always going to think like a poor person. He's never going to be able to be this sort of like truly shallow man-child the way that all of those people at that upper strata are, because they've never had to do anything for their lives. Gatsby's play acting as those people, and he play acts as those people his entire life, even when he doesn't have the money. And because he thinks that, if I can be like them, that means I'm great. When they're just the most fucking awful, despicable pieces of shit, because they were never even given an opportunity based on the circumstances of the birth to like be a proper person because of how much wealth they were born with.
Yes.
You know, yeah. And yeah. It's fun that we're doing this after Kane, because there's so much of this in Kane, you know, like obviously yes. Citizen Kane is hugely informed as a movie, I think, by the writing of Fitzgerald, maybe Gatsby specifically, but certainly something like This Side of Paradise, that like there's a lot of synergy between what both those stories are about.
Well, because the other major theme of Gatsby that it is like celebrated for is its treatment of class, and that it is about how class in America is closer to being a caste system at this point. And yes. Again, this is only more true 100 years later, in that it is something that is like immutable at birth, and that Gatsby, no matter how rich he gets, no matter how much he tries to ingratiate himself with this crowd, he will never be one of them. He will never be good enough for Daisy. He will never be truly accepted in that world, because that's how this works. You know, when you have a class system that is closer to a caste system, the money in your bank account doesn't matter. Because again, Donald Trump and Elon Musk have completely different actual like lines in their bank account, right? But they play into the same caste system in American society because of that overall presentation and where they were born. And obviously race plays into this hugely. That's another thing. I had forgotten how barbed the like racism stuff is in Gatsby. Like it has its moment of failure with anti-Semitism with Meyer Wolfsheim, but it's also very pointed about like people like Tom are horrific racists. Like, and it's using language that we would recognize as very modern now. And again, this is middle of Jim Crow when Fitzgerald is writing this. We are so far from the idea of like civil rights being like animating a thing that is like actually happened in American society, right? And so like that part of it I think is astonishing. But yeah, I mean, the other most famous line of the book is when, at the very end, it's the last conversation Nick has with Gatsby, and he says, "They're a rotten crowd. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." And that's such a powerful moment because in the context of the book also, that's when Nick has just learned. We've learned it earlier, but it's when Nick has learned Gatsby's backstory and who he actually is. And I feel like he's trying to, because that's also part of that scene is that he's kind of hiding that he knows what Daisy is up to. And he's trying to get Gatsby to realize you have more to offer the world than what you've been trying. And I think the way he puts it there is so powerful,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's just one of those very iconic scenes in the book. Because it's also, because one of the things there is you've got Nick as a character and his relationship with Gatsby, I just think is so fascinating. There's this sort of relationship, this reflection they have of each other. Like it's interesting to me that I think so many people identify Nick as being the like author surrogate character, which I always find fascinating because it's like, no, the author surrogate is split between Nick and Gatsby, and that they're both like the same guy who had a deviation point is what it feels like to me. That like at some point in the past, Nick could have been Gatsby if he had chased after that life. Right, they're both these guys from the West who are not themselves wealthy, but lived in the proximity of wealth. With Nick, because he's the cousin of Daisy. So it's like he lives in the proximity of that wealth the same ways that Fitzgerald did, right? Fitzgerald himself was not born wealthy. He was born poor, but he always lived in the proximity of people who are very wealthy. He went to school at Yale with people who are very wealthy. He served in the military amongst people who are wealthy, and then he fell in love with a woman who's very wealthy. And so both of them are these guys who live in the proximity of wealth, do not themselves have wealth. And Gatsby is the one who makes the choice to pursue it at that point in his life, when he is still a kid, and Nick chooses to pursue it when he is much older, right? When he is like 28, 29 years old, and he moves to New York, become a bondsman, and kind of chase the American dream that way. And so if there's anything that like separates Gatsby and Nick, it's just at what stage in their life did they choose to try to chase after the illusion that is the American dream. And Gatsby dedicated his whole life to it. And Nick is trying it out now, and his great fortune is that because he's only trying it now, he has enough wherewithal to see before it's too late that it's a fucking trap. But there's just something about those characters and how they are paired and how they are shadowed, how they are reflections of each other, and both reflections of the author in different ways. I just find that relationship deeply compelling, and it's one of the many things about the adaptations that I think just does not land, is they don't figure out Nick or Gatsby properly, and so they don't figure out their relationship properly either. And it is the central relationship of the book. It is not Gatsby and Daisy. That is not the main relationship. The main relationship is Nick and Gatsby, and it's like that's the centerpiece of the story.
Yes. I think the second movie gets closer because it at least lets the two actors play characters and like have chemistry and like be, because everyone in the 74 movie is on Xanax and is just floating through the movie like a zombie. So there's just no personality to any of it. And the second movie also makes at least some kind of concerted effort to try to translate Nick into a cinematic character, because I do think the biggest stumbling block, other than just the language of the book itself for filmmakers, is that Nick is a very literary character, because he is our first-person point of view. I agree, not necessarily an author insert author surrogate, but he is the vehicle through which the story is chosen.
Yes.
And it's interesting, the 74 movie just does that very directly. They just have him standing in the the corner of every scene watching things happen, and he has no character. He is just literally the person watching the movie happen, which is very funny when you're making a movie. You don't need that. The camera is doing that for us. You don't need Nick to be doing that for us. But like, and the second movie does a little bit more to try to like give him personality, give him a role in the story, let him be there. But like, and not that he doesn't have a role in the story. He does have a very active role in the story in the book, but you do have to, like, Nick is the thing you would have to most actively play with to translate from book to film, because you would have to try to, like, tease out all the aspects of personality we hear in his narration. And to me, the answer to that would be, don't have him narrate. Take that narration from the book and write the character who is suggested to us by it. Because Nick does have a very clear voice. It is not a completely outside the story narration. He is a very heavily, like, characterized narrator. But if you have him in the role of narrator, then you're always having him stand outside it a little bit, and that's wrong. That's just a wrong reading of the book, because he is not completely outside it. It is a memory of his emotions and feelings and reactions and what he learned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's essential to like make him an active participant, because he is an active participant. He is not a like removed abstract narrator. He is very heavily characterized. He is a very sarcastic person. He's a very people-pleasing person, and he's kind of manipulative in the way that like people pleasers are, right? And that's part of what sort of generates some of the drama in the book, is that he is very like willing to keep these people's secrets, to just kind of go along with what's happening, because he's not trying to make waves. And I think there's a way in a movie that just looks like, when you're not getting access to their internal like thinking, if all you're doing is directly literally what the book has in terms of dialogue, he just looks like a dude standing in the corner of the room. So you have to find ways to give him dialogue, or make him more physically active in scenes, to show that is part of who he is that he is this people pleaser, is that he is a bit of a liar and a manipulator. That Jordan at the end of the book accuses him of being one of the bad drivers in the story. And that was one of my things that as a teacher was have them do a response trying to use evidence from the story. Like, do you think that she's right? Is Nick one of the bad drivers? We have Jordan, Tom, and Daisy are all explicitly, literally bad drivers. Is Nick one of the metaphorical bad drivers in the book as well? And there's plenty of the space the book gives you to say that, yes, like he is one of the people, because he is also pursuing this wealth, and but he's doing it on like the sidelines and trying to just nudge things a little bit to make everybody happy, that he contributes to make everything fall apart. And I think that like the movies don't capture that energy, but I think it's one of the very vital pieces of the book, is I do think that Nick is a very vibrant character, because everything you're being told in the book is from his perspective, and the language of the book is so vibrant and brilliant, and it's Nick that's telling you that stuff. And I feel like the book is so good at characterizing that, and none of the movies have done the requisite work to translate that character to film.
Yes. I do think with these classic books that are written in the first person, I think the first test, if you're getting a screenwriter to do it, is your instinct to have the narration in the movie or not? If yes, don't write the movie. You're fucked. You're just not going to do it. Like, if anyone were, this is never going to happen because of the way the estate is set up, but if you were to make a Catcher in the Rye movie, which you could do, and I think you could and I don't think it would be that hard. I think you could make a good Catcher in the Rye movie. Unless you have the narration.
Yes.
Unless you have Holden Caulfield reading the book to us while it's happening. Then you're fucked. You can't make a movie that way. And I do think it happens with both of these movies too. I think it is better in the 2013 movie because they do at least try to build a cinematic framing device and cinematic grammar around it, which you need when you have narration. It's cheesy as hell. Don't get me wrong, the way they do it. And like at the end, he's like, I've written a book and it's called Gatsby, but no, it's The Great Gatsby. It's stupid, but it is at least like an attempt. In the 1974 movie, it's just narration that kind of comes in when it wants to and then leaves for long stretches, and it's very distracting. But like, I think in either case, one of the things that really struck me, Sean, going back to The Great Gatsby, is that I don't think this is a book that is particularly special for just what the story is, what, the Wikipedia plot summary is. It's special almost entirely for how it is told. It is special for the way it is written. It is special for the words that come onto the page to express these ideas. It is special for the way Nick is written as a character in and around these figures, and for the way the story sort of gradually unfolds through the prose, that's what makes it special. And so if you're making a movie and your main thing is to just kind of do the plot, and both movies do the plot fairly directly with minor alterations that, as you say, maybe are stupid alterations, but they're very momentary alterations. Yeah. And then they just sometimes plaster some of the language on top of it, but out of context. You're left with a very hollow shell that doesn't really tell you what is special about it. And that's why like a true adaptation would take all of that language and try to figure out what are the cinematic equivalents of how we can do what Fitzgerald is writing. And I think the closest either movie does is Baz Luhrmann is very good at doing like the big crazy party sequences in a way that I do think evoke what Fitzgerald is trying to get at about the out of control kind of debauchery of this and ostentatiousness of it. And like that is an actual attempt to translate the words without literally having Nick tell us what the party is, just show it. And that's something Baz Luhrmann is good at, because he's basically just making Moulin Rouge in those scenes, and he can do that. When it is other kinds of scenes, and like, you know, the Valley of Ashes, or it is, you know, us hearing about the flashback of who Gatsby was when he was Jay Gats and how he turned into Gatsby and all that, that's a level of subtlety in like use of language and use of form and style that Baz Luhrmann is not well equipped for. So you have scenes where like Leonardo DiCaprio turns to the camera and goes, and that's when I decided I would be Jay Gatsby. And I go, okay, you didn't get this, and move on. Right?
Yes. Yeah. It is like, it's just like a very frustrating thing in looking at the adaptations, because yes, the language of the book is so rich. Like I think that Fitzgerald is just such an accomplished writer. Like the quality of his prose is so tremendous. You know, obviously this is the thing that made him super popular in part in his days, that like he just had a fantastic and very like particular command of the English language. But there's so many ways to translate that into film using filmic techniques. And it's that thing where it's like I'm reading the book in my head, I can imagine the movie so clearly, because it's just the book is the size of a movie. So it's just, it feels like you can, like I'm just can see it in my mind's eye. And it's just always so frustrating that when you look at the adaptations, they're just shit. They don't get it.
Well, because I mean, honestly, the best adaptation of this book in a weird way is just Citizen Kane. It is just like, if you, it's not literally the story of Gatsby. It has many, many differences, obviously. But like in getting at the ideas, like I do genuinely think the party scenes in the Baz Luhrmann film are good, but I also think like the best version of the kind of party scene that Fitzgerald writes is probably the scene in Citizen Kane when they're celebrating the like newspaper success, and he's got all the girls in, and like you see kind of the shit-eating grin on Kane's face, and you see how much this is a performance for him, right? Like that's the kind of scene, and it's obviously inspired by, because that scene is set in the Jazz Age, and it's like depicting these ideas. But like that whole idea, and like the fact that Citizen Kane is about the idea of a character who is essentially unknowable, and we can only know him through the outside, through other people's perspectives. That is also true of The Great Gatsby. That is what Gatsby is someone that like we only have a very limited sense of his interiority through other people. And so like the first, because Gatsby doesn't show up until chapter 3, right? And in chapters 1 and 2, we're hearing about him from other people. That's a technique very akin to what Orson Welles does in Citizen Kane. And is a place where I think you can see the influence. And that's the kind of thing you would need to have in a movie, rather than, again, if you're just using the exact literary techniques Fitzgerald does, but now with a Hollywood actor reading it in a booth, played over images illustrating it, you're not actually translating the novel. You're just doing some kind of weird audiobook that isn't as good as actually reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on to... Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to move on to the adaptations, since we're already kind of getting into that?
Before that, I wanted like just a little bit more on the book stuff, partially because you have a bunch of little sections that you've cut out here at the bottom. I don't know if there's any in particular you want to point out, but I definitely have like one or two sequences in the book I want to kind of shout out, partially because they don't really come up in the movie, and so like there's just a couple of things. I'll start with like just one thing I think that I really like about the book that I don't think either movie really gets. I think it's kind of combined some of the interpretations in the movies, you kind of get a version of this that comes out really well, is the opening chapters. So the book is structured 9 chapters. It is clearly split into thirds. Chapters 1, 2, 3 are a set, 4, 5, 6 are a set, 7, 8, 9 are a set. And 1, 2, 3 are interesting because they're all set at 3 different parties. Chapter 1 is the dinner party at Daisy's house. Chapter 2 is the crazy party that Tom brings Nick to with Myrtle. And then chapter 3 is the first party at Gatsby's house, which is where we meet Gatsby for the first time. And I always love this opening because it gives you this sort of like illustration of how we're, of these different valences on this society, these different viewpoints, where you have like the very stiff, proper, rich like dinner party that's also incredibly boring. Where you've got Jordan, Nick, Tom, and Daisy all there, and it's supposed to be this sort of like, we're the upper crust, and it's all, very proper in high class, and at the same time, there is just this like corruption and this just darkness bubbling underneath all of that, which is Myrtle calling. And you just get the sense that, like, that all of this is built on bullshit, because that's also where you get, like, Tom's racism comes out front and center in that scene. And so there's something about the, like, we're all proper and upper class, but it's all awful and terrible and evil, but it's just evil in ways that we're pushing underneath the surface. That's where you get one of the most famous lines in the book, which is the beautiful fools from Daisy, right, where she says, like, that's what all girls should be, a beautiful fool. Then after that, you go to party number 2, which is with Myrtle, and it's just, I think this is probably my favorite scene in the Luhrmann movie, of where I think it captures the sense of like the inhibition, but the intimacy of it, the uncomfortable intimacy of just how tight this space is, and it just boils over into the violence of Tom, and that this is now that little like evil, that corruption that was biting underneath the edge of chapter 1. This is what that is, and it's like in full. It's Tom drunk, bringing his fucking lover around, who is only there because his wealth has sort of brought her to him. And that's like the only thing she can get out of this relationship. He like buys the fucking dog and all that shit. And then when she starts to overstep the box that he has put her in, which is when she says Daisy's name, he fucking slaps her and breaks her goddamn nose. And that's where you do get in Luhrmann, you get that great moment of Tobey Maguire looking outside, and this is maybe the only part of the narration that I thought they did a good job with, of just bringing it in, of him saying I'm within, without, and seeing himself on the street and looking up. Like, that's like a good use of, if you're going to do the narration, illustrating it visually really well. And then you get Gatsby's party, which is where Jordan gives one of my favorite little lines in the book. And the Luhrmann movie does pull this line in for her dialogue, where she says she loves large parties because they're the only ones in which you have any privacy. And it's the magic of Gatsby's party. And I think that line by Jordan is what captures what is amazing about Gatsby's parties, is that they're so huge and so spacious, and everybody's there, that you get to be alone with people. And that is both like, it's a double-edged sword. For Nick, it is this thing where he's able to connect with people. He's able to connect with Jordan. He can connect with Gatsby. It's the first like sort of real connections he develops with anybody in New York, because he can be alone with them, and in that privacy gawk at the marvel of this insane party and wander around into the library where Owl Eyes is and all that shit. And that privacy creates an intimacy between those people. But it's also an intimacy that curdles in chapter 6 in the book when Daisy is there, and you see that, like, it is not the kind of thing that is proper for the high class people, and it's what marks him as a poor man, is that these are the kinds of parties he throws. But that introduction, that kind of triptych, those 3 chapters, those 3 parties, it's just such an amazing opening to the book that gives you, when we're thinking about the ways in which these stories like A Citizen Kane teach you kind of everything you need to know and tease it out at the beginning, it's just a textbook fucking opening that does that in such a powerful way, where you just learn all the different kind of language you need to process what's going on in this society, and our major 3 kind of groups of characters and the major 3 locations involved. And it's just, man, it's one of the best opening sections of a book, I think, in terms of laying out everything it needs in an incredibly efficient and artful manner.
I completely agree, and I do think this is where the Luhrmann film is is good. Like, I genuinely think the first hour or so of this movie is pretty good, and I think doing those 3 chapters, Luhrmann is very good at staging those scenes. They all have a very clear analog to scenes in Moulin Rouge, which I think is funny. Like, the second chapter party, that is just the early scene where Ewan McGregor meets all the other, like, circus people, and they're all around his typewriter and all of that, before they go to the ball. It's, honestly, it is the opening of Moulin Rouge, because Moulin Rouge opens with the Ewan McGregor character in a basically sanatorium, and it's very dark and sad in the future. Then he starts writing about his history. Then it starts with small party, middle party, big party. It is just a remake of Moulin Rouge with the language of The Great Gatsby, and Moulin Rouge is Luhrmann's best movie, so he knows how to do it, and like that part of the movie works, I think, very well, because he's able to just go through those pieces, and he understands how to cinematically illustrate what Fitzgerald is getting at about the dynamics, the social character dynamics going on in those 3 situations. But if I'm transitioning here, Sean, into my notes, here's a moment that is where maybe the movie breaks for me, or starts to break, is when you get to the introduction of Gatsby. I like how they do it, where it is that it's become the meme online of yes. Leo. You know, it's one of the many Leonardo DiCaprio memes. I feel like the 2 big ones are this scene where he like tips his cup to Nick, and then the one in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood when he leans up at his chair and points at the TV. Those are the 2 big Leo memes online. But this is the scene where he meets Gatsby, and you find out, and it's like cued with the music and the fireworks that, oh my God, that's Gatsby. But then you have Gatsby smiles at him. And in the book, you get one of the best paragraphs in the book where Nick describes Gatsby's smile. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced or seemed to face the whole eternal world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey. Great paragraph. Shouldn't be in the movie. What that should be is stage directions for the actor. And I think Leonardo DiCaprio can play that. And I think if you mute the scene, his smile, you can tell he's thinking that paragraph in his head of how to play the scene. But if you unmute it, you have Tobey Maguire being asked to read the paragraph over it, and it's too redundant, and I think kind of breaks a lot of the work the movie is doing that I think is good work in the first half of that film to cinematically illustrate what is on the page, because now you're just doubling it, and you're layering it, and it becomes a problem.
Yeah. Well, you're doubling it and layering it, but then also you're forced to make weird edits to the text in order to fit or whatever. And so it's like you're kind of also butchering the prose at the same time. And it's like, that's part of the problem with that approach. One sequence, this is a thing that both movies try to do some version of it. And I think it's maybe this might be my favorite part in the whole book. And I think it's a very hard one to translate to movies, although I do think there are ways you could do it. But this is at the end of chapter 6. You have all the stuff where I just think like they just don't get chapter 6 right in either of the movies, really. But you have Daisy's left the party. Gatsby's convinced that she didn't like it because she didn't like it, which is a moment that both movies cut. We'll talk about that, but they keep those lines. It's just fucking weird.
They keep those lines, but they don't show the scenes where she doesn't like it. Because in the book, Nick sees her being visibly uncomfortable when she's not with Gatsby at the party.
Yes.
And then when Gatsby says that, it's meaningful because Nick knows it's true. But in the movie, you don't really see her at the party, and then Gatsby says this, and it plays like especially the way DiCaprio plays as though he is paranoid and wrong. But in the book, he is having a moment of insight for the first fucking time in his life.
Yes, and it's just so funny when it's like yeah, she didn't like it. I'm like, you didn't? I mean, she seemed like she liked it in both movies. It's so funny. But after that, they do, this is when Gatsby starts talking. He has Nick just describes to us in the book that they talk for a long time. And this is where I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs here because it's like the last few paragraphs of this chapter. But it's just like why I think this is a key point in the book, and it's one of my favorite parts of it as just like from a writing perspective, is that this is, in my mind, the only time in the entire book that you're actually given access to Gatsby's interiority, in the way that it transitions into this narration. It opens up in terms of this sequence with Nick describing the conversation. He says, he talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself perhaps that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was, ... They give some of that as dialogue to Leo in the Luhrmann movie. But then when you come out of the ... this is where I believe in what's happening here from a writer's perspective, that including that, like, this prolonged ellipses, is that we're transitioning directly into Gatsby's interiority. And both movies try to do a sort of flashback thing, but I don't think they really capture this scene. So this is, in my mind, this is you're just getting access to Gatsby's actual memory of this event. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees, and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the 2 changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalks really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it, if he climbed alone, and once there he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl, and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. So that's, in my mind, that is Gatsby, his internal memory of this scene, right? And they, in both movies, include like versions of this kind of flashback where you get this. In the Luhrmann one includes some of that narration, though very heavily edited. But then you get this last paragraph. This is my favorite paragraph in the whole fucking book, because you come out of that and you come back into what I think is more clearly Nick's voice and his commentary on this memory. Through all he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was something more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. And that to me is like, that's the book. It's such a fucking great structure of giving us this sort of one little break into Gatsby's interiority, which is the appalling sentimentality that Nick refers to in that final paragraph, is the excessively purple prose. Like, even for Fitzgerald, it goes so far, the like climbing up the stairs of the sidewalk to drink upon the pap of life. Like, it goes so far that you see the romanticist in Gatsby. You finally like see this is how he sees the world. Her blossoming form like a flower and the incarnation being complete. It is when he is fused to her and he is like combined with her, and he can never separate himself because he's so given to this idea. And that being this thing that Nick, as a much older man than Gatsby was when he had that memory, looking at this as this like this essential something of youth, this essential something of reaching for this dream, this hope, this optimism that when you become an adult you lose, and he can't say it, he can't find it, he can't bring it anymore, and it's on the tip of his tongue, and he just can't quite get to it because he has lost that degree of innocence that Gatsby had, that purity that Gatsby had in that memory. And I think that's just such an essential moment, and it's one of those where it's like, if I was directing a Gatsby movie, like I would need to find some moment to have the actor who is Nick physically play that. Like find like how do we shoot and play a close-up or something to express this idea of having him listening to Gatsby tell this incredible, romantic, kind of sappy story, and Nick seeing something beautiful but something like lost and forgotten in it. And it's just like, it's a certain essence to the tragedy of the book, that this is a thing that we all lose and that some of us spend chasing forever, never to find again. That both adaptations lose out on because I don't think they see what the tragedy of the book is, which is what is being communicated here.
I think it is a very similar problem that adaptations or stagings of Romeo and Juliet have.
Yes.
which is that they fall into the myth that is self-evidently a myth in the text, that this truly is a like love for the ages, destined, amazing, perfect, beautiful. And it's not. It's an illusion. It's more like Gatsby is much more upfront about this than Romeo and Juliet is. Like Romeo and Juliet, I don't think completely dismisses the feelings they have, but I do think Shakespeare is very aware in that text that they are fucking kids who don't really know what they're doing. And so their emotions run out of control and wind up in this tragedy. And part of that is because they have this very imperfect idea of what love is. And in The Great Gatsby, I think it's even more black and white, which is that it's not love. It's the idea of love. He doesn't love Daisy. He doesn't know Daisy. He loves the idea of Daisy. And at a certain point, he finds out what she actually is, and it breaks his brain because he can't accept that what he loved wasn't real, which means the love wasn't real. And, you know, I think like that scene that you just read in the Baz Luhrmann movie is a very well done cinematic translation of that scene in so much as Gatsby's memory. Like, I think it does a very good job of showing Gatsby's interiority of that memory and how intoxicating it is. But it is missing the scene that you would need to have in the reverse of showing that it is fake in some way. Like, and I think there's many ways you could do this cinematically. You could have Nick say it, but I don't think that would be as effective as, like, having Nick walk into the memory and have the lighting change and have him see it as something much more mundane, right? Like, there's ways you could do that cinematically, just in the same way that Fitzgerald flips the prose there and goes from the flowery to Nick going, that was too flowery. You could do that cinematically and show that, like, this is how Gatsby sees it. This is what it actually was. There's ways you can do that. But I think it is something, and like, that's the thing, the Luhrmann film is very good in several moments, I think, of selling you on how beautiful this romance is. Like, when it's using, like, the big Lana Del Rey song, and, like, I like the scene where they're in his mansion, he's getting all the shirts out and all that I think shows, like, their intoxication. Like, it sells me on the idea that they are attracted to each other in a way that the 1974 movie, I don't believe any of these people are even human beings. They're robots who move around and bang their Ken and Barbie doll parts against each other. Like, they're not human. But, like, it is so always missing the other half of it, which, hey, Baz Luhrmann has also made a Romeo and Juliet movie that missed the point. So, you know, he's good at this. He's good at taking these works that have a layer of subtlety that he does not have access to. Although it's funny because he also made Moulin Rouge that I think does kind of get this trick near the end, but that's okay. That's an original movie, and I guess he figured it out there, but not in these adaptations.
Yes. Well, you know, as someone who's also seen Romeo plus Juliet a lot, as someone who's taught Romeo and Juliet a lot, his Gatsby movie and his Romeo plus Juliet movie, they're somehow the same movie. Like, they're not, but they are somehow actually the exact same movie. I guess kind of the Moulin Rouge is too. He just kind of made the same movie over and over again with mild differences. Is kind of what it felt like.
Well, because Moulin Rouge, it's funny because he made Romeo plus Juliet and then Moulin Rouge, but Moulin Rouge is it's being that kind of melodrama is what it's trying to do. Now, it's pitched not at the Shakespearean or the Fitzgerald level, but at a very specific, like, turn-of-the-century melodrama idea, which I think allows Moulin Rouge to work in a tonal space that I think these other stories are not suited for, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Well, at this point, I think let's transition into going just full on at the movies, because I think this central point, I think, is outside of maybe the sort of I don't know, the staid and dull everything about the 1974 movie is maybe the worst part about it. But in terms of as a direct adaptational choice in terms of how to bring the plot in, I think the central mistake of both of them is that they both think that is a love story between Gatsby and Daisy, and it is just profoundly not that. But let's talk about the 1974 movie. So this movie had a very complicated road to production. I've just got a couple little notes on it. There's a lot of very interesting people that were attached to this movie in various capacities. So originally Truman Capote was going to write the screenplay, and then that ultimately did not come through. I think he wrote part of a screenplay. It was considered ultimately unusable, and so they didn't go with it. They then hired Francis.
I want to see Truman Capote's Great Gatsby. Goddamn
exactly. So they then hired Francis Ford Coppola, who had just finished filming The Godfather, but it was not yet released when he was writing the screenplay. So Coppola completed the script, but he has asserted repeatedly over the years that the director, Jack Clayton, largely ignored large parts of the script, and that he's just as quoted as saying, like, that's not the movie I wrote. Others who have read Coppola's script say that it is vastly better than what the movie ended up being. I tried to look to see if I could just like read it somewhere, right? It was unsuccessful to actually find it.
But remember that Coppola, before The Godfather, did do a lot of script work on movies where he did not direct. So this was normal for him at the time. Like, he wrote Patton. I think he wrote one of Oliver Stone's early movies. But like, yeah, he did write for other directors at the time. And there's a couple of cases where he's since like disowned those movies based on his scripts. I think Patton is the one that like generally is probably the closest to like a movie that he wrote that actually kind of stood the test of time. But he is one of those directors who, once he was able to direct his own scripts, was much better with it than when other people were doing it.
Yeah. One other area of consternation in the movie was the casting of Jay Gatsby. There were a lot of actors approached for the part before it ultimately went to Robert Redford. Some of those names were Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson, which you have to keep in mind, this is 1974 Jack Nicholson, which is maybe still not makes sense, but it's not. Don't picture like modern day Jack Nicholson, which would be insane. I feel like a little bit younger than this Jack Nicholson would actually be a cool choice for Gatsby. 1974, he's maybe still a little bit too Jack Nicholson-y for that.
He would be 40 at that point also, which is a problem with the 2013 movie we'll talk about. But I actually think of these actors here, and the other one was Marlon Brando. I think Nicholson would be the best choice of those, because I think Nicholson is the most against type. I think Nicholson is the one who could show that something's off with this guy. It's actually why, like, I think Leo is a good choice today. Whatever other problems with the 2013 movie, Leo can be a weird-ass madman when you look at his other work. Like, he plays broken weirdos. And I think, like, that's not who the Robert Redford type is. Like, Beatty could maybe do it. Brando could maybe do it. But I think Nicholson, that excites me. I like that idea.
Yes. Yeah, again, I think if you were younger Nicholson, I think it would make sense. Again, 1974, he's just a little bit too Jack Nicholson-y at that point. The movie was ultimately released to middling reviews, but it was a commercial success. It grossed $24 million on a $7 million budget, which is, it's always funny when you talk about the money that old movies made.
Yeah.
because that's like a rounding error in a modern film budget in gross. But, that's obviously a lot of money for a very modest budget. It did win some rewards for like production design stuff, like costuming and things like that. In terms of the cast and crew, our director is Jack Clayton. I've never seen one of his other movies, but he's a British director. In fact, most of the people involved in the production, other than Coppola, were British, which is an interesting choice for such an essentially American story. I'm not sure why they went with British people behind the scenes. His career began in the 50s with the acclaimed film Room at the Top, and he directed several other acclaimed films through the 60s before directing Gatsby. Again, I haven't seen those other movies, so I don't know. The screenplay, again, was Coppola, though, again, he sort of disowned the movie later on. The cinematography was by Douglas Slocum, who worked on lots of big movies, most notably the Indiana Jones movies. Obviously,
he was Steven Spielberg's DP before he switched to Janusz Kaminski, who he started working with in the 90s. But yeah, Slocum. Here's the thing, Sean. Other than Jack Clayton, all the names on this movie are heavy hitters. Every single one. And it's amazing how much bad direction can bring heavy hitters down.
Yes, because we also, in terms of editing, we have Tom Priestley, who around this time had a couple movies that really stood out to me. He did Deliverance, which was the movie he edited before Gatsby. Obviously very different movies, but it's a very notable film. And then he also did the John Hurt 1984, if you're looking for another big classic high school English book edited by Tom Priestley in the film movie. I don't know why you'd be looking for something so specific, but he did do one of those.
Should I make that a letterbox list, Sean, for everyone in one of those obscure letterbox lists?
The most obscure letterbox list of all time. Classic high school English literary book adaptations edited by Tom Priestley. There's at least 2 movies you could put on that list. And then the music is by Nelson Riddle, which I should look up if that's that guy's actual name, because that sounds like a pseudonym, Nelson Riddle. It's the Riddler's fucking cousin is Nelson Riddle.
Yes.
And in terms of our big cast, we've got, of course, Robert Redford as Jay Gatsby, Mia Farrow as Daisy Buchanan, Bruce Dern as Tom Buchanan, which that's the only performance I like in the movie, is I do think Bruce Dern is a good Tom. Sam Waterston, Jack McCoy from Law and Order is Nick Carraway, not his best turn. Karen Black is Myrtle. Scott Wilson is George Wilson. I actually think that's a pretty good performance as well. I like Wilson as Wilson. Lois Chiles is Jordan Baker, which is also, I think, a pretty good Jordan. There's a lot more Jordan stuff in this than there is in the 2013 one. Edward Herrmann as Ewing Klipspringer. Howard Da Silva as Meyer Wolfsheim. And then Catherine Lee Scott as Catherine, Myrtle's sister. So we've got a Wilson as Wilson, and we've got a Catherine as Catherine in this movie.
Indeed we do. But you know what we don't have? Any signs of life.
So I don't despise this movie as much as you, Jonathan. I mean, I don't particularly like it.
Can I go off?
But yes, you take the floor, Jonathan. What particularly rubs you off about this movie?
Everything. This is the most dull movie I have ever watched. I don't even know what the competition would be. The only competition, and this is my overwhelming impression, was flashbacks to memories I have suppressed of being in like middle school or elementary school, and it's recess time, but it's raining outside, so they put us all in the gym, and they turn on the VHS of, like, the BBC Narnia adaptations or something like that, where, like, Aslan is a big puppet, and it looks like shit, all of that stuff. That's what this made me think of like, oh, this is one of those bad movies whose purpose is just to be shown to kids when the teachers don't want to work. And it exists on VHS, and that's what it's for. No adult in their right mind would ever watch this. That is the kind of dull this is. It is not just so heatless as a romance. It is shot, written, and acted like a fucking bad perfume commercial. But there's no passion anywhere else. There's no passion to the friendships, to the jealousy, to the anger. There's no emotion anywhere in the movie. It is made like a cheap TV movie dressed up in the skin suit of Hollywood glamour. I think it is like horribly directed. I think like every shot choice is wrong. I think the blocking is wrong. I think the cinematography, this is the worst thing Slocum ever shot, because the whole thing has basically a Gaussian filter over the lens that is diffusing the light in a way that makes everything glitter super ostentatiously. And the moment this movie like broke me, like I stopped the movie and started writing stuff down. Like I think we're recording this a few weeks early, but if I've done my work correctly, there will be a review of this movie up on my website for Movie of the Week this week, because I basically wound up writing a whole thing about it without meaning to, just sitting on my phone while watching the movie. And the thing that stopped me is early in the movie is when they're like, I think they're eating at Tom and Daisy's house, and somebody comes in with a platter of silverware, so like goblets and silver plates and everything, and the camera does a big dramatic zoom in. That's the other thing. This movie uses zooms, and unless your name is Robert Altman or Hong Sang-soo, you can fuck off with your zooms. You don't know what you're doing. Like, you have to be careful with zooms. They are a dangerous thing. It is like working with plutonium. You can make some big energy with it, but you can also blow your movie up, and this movie blows itself up with its zooms. And it does this big first off, someone says something, and then everything goes silent, and it zooms in on the silverware to show like, oh my God. And every inch of every part of every goblet, plate, everything is glimmering with like these big light blooms because of the filter they have on the camera and the kind of light they are using. It is one of the ugliest shots I have ever seen in a movie. It is trying to show like how like ostentatious and glamorous things are, but it is the movie's one visual trick, and it's on everything. And so there are just light blooms everywhere, and it constantly stops the action, stops the dialogue to show you this over in the corner, or like zoom in on a thing that it wants you to see all the glimmering. The actors are caked in sweat through the entire film. And I understand some parts of the book it's like summer and it's hot, but
so
like
the whole book it's summer.
It's okay.
It takes place over this one summer. Yeah.
They go too far with it though. Everyone is drenched in sweat the entire movie. They look uncomfortable, and because they are drenched in sweat and they are using these big studio lights and this Gaussian filter, everyone has these light blooms coming off of them everywhere. It is horrifically ugly as a film, like unbelievably like that this made it to theaters as ugly as it is. But then also the style of it is, like I said, it has to keep stopping over and over for things. It can never be doing two things at once. It's always having to be excessive and obvious. And like, again, those moments like where you have to just stop, triple underline the thing that is happening. That also happens when Tom slaps Myrtle, and the whole movie stops and everyone's like, and looking around. And I think not understanding that like part of why that scene is powerful in the book is that it's casual, and I don't think people are reacting as we would today watching it in a movie. And so the movie just whiffs that moment. Or, the thing with the plates, that is when Gatsby is preparing for the butler for Daisy's visit. That's when that happens. But it's just over and over again, the movie can't do two things at once. I was, like, so relieved when you get to the 2013 movie and characters, like, talk at a normal pace. They'll talk over each other. Something will happen visually and someone will be talking. It's able to do two things at once, like a normal movie does. I think Nick is such a stumbling block to this movie because they have his narration. It's very irregular over the course of the movie. There's no attempt at doing a framing device to kind of work the narration into the film. So it just comes in and out at moments where, like, it doesn't trust its own visuals. And then the biggest problem is the performances are awful. And they're from good people. You read, like, I was excited to watch this movie because I'm like, Robert Redford, Bruce Dern, Sam Waterston, Karen Black, this is great. This is going to be awesome. And it's the worst performance every single one of those people has ever given. I agree Bruce Dern is the best part of this. It is also probably the worst Bruce Dern performance because, like, all of them are, it feels like they all took a bottle of Xanax. It is so low key. They all talk slowly and mostly in mumbled whispers. Like, it's a very quiet movie where the people talk as though they are on drugs. There is no chemistry or spark between any of them. Nick has no personality. He is just standing in the corner of scenes watching. Gatsby barely has a personality. Everybody feels uncomfortable with what they are doing. The blocking of scenes is so undynamic and bad. This movie hurt me to watch. It took me 3 different sittings to get through the whole thing. I found it basically unwatchable. I just could not stand any part of this movie.
Yeah, I certainly do not have anywhere near that kind of toxic reaction. I mean, I'm not going to defend the movie because I don't think it's a good movie. I definitely, like, the filter thing is that you're talking about is so true, though. And it's one of the things that's, like, really just, like, weird because it just feels like you're watching, like, a 1940s or 1950s movie where they do one of the shots of, like, oh, we need our, like, starlet to look very glamorous for this one shot.
Yes.
And so you put that kind of filter on it, and it's like they forgot to take it off. They just left it on for the whole movie, and you're like, what the fuck is going on?
Well, it's like, Battlefield Earth always gets made fun of for having the constant Dutch angles through the whole movie. And Roger Ebert had that line about how the director has learned that sometimes directors tilt their camera for dramatic effect. He just hasn't learned why. And that's the thing, is if you do it for the whole movie, then there is no dramatic effect. And it's the same thing here. There cannot be a dramatic effect if it's the whole film.
Yeah, I think the one thing I will defend is I do really actually like Bruce Dern's performance a lot and Lois Chiles as Jordan. Like, I think that those, and actually Scott Wilson as George Wilson. I think for me, the big problem with all the other actors in the movie, other than those 3, is that they all feel like they are reading their dialogue out of the book. Like, in terms of, like, it's the dialogue is taken directly from the book, which is fine. I think there's nothing about Fitzgerald's dialogue that needs to be edited that much. It, like, works totally fine as dialogue, but not when the actor is reading it as though they're standing on a stage doing a dramatic reading of The Great Gatsby with book in hand, right? Like, that's the vibe that Robert Redford gives. That's the vibe that Mia Farrow gives. That's the vibe that Sam Waterston gives. And it's just like their dialogue is extremely painful because it's slow, it's super deliberate, and again, it sounds like you're reading it out of a book, not like you have learned a script for a movie performance and you are, like, embodying that character. I think the thing that Bruce Dern and Lois Chiles as Jordan in particular do really well is they feel like those people to me. Like, they feel like those characters from the book brought to life. There's a casualness to them that I like a lot. There's an easiness to them. Where it feels like the way that Bruce Dern reads the dialogue as Tom is like a person saying those things as though they're their own words, which is a low bar for, asking for a performance. But it is also, I just think he embodies the character so casually. And there are lots of moments in the movie where I think it feels like his performance understands the sort of simple confidence that Tom has. That is one of the things I'm not as big of a fan of in the 2013 movie because everything's so fucking extra in that movie that Tom doesn't need to go extra for anything because he's assured that everything's going to go his way because everything's gone his way his entire life. So, like, even though they changed some of the elements of the scene to kind of take out some of these moments, the scene that's the chapter 7 in the hotel room, I like the sort of, like, assumption that Bruce Dern has is like, what are you talking about? No, she's not going to go with you. She's my wife and she loves me. And there's, it's not an incredibly passionate performance, but I don't think that Tom asks for a very passionate performance. And I think Bruce Dern is like one of the only actors in the movie. He's the only actor with like a lot of material in the movie that feels like he understands a register that the performance can work at. And all the other actors feel like they can't figure it out. Now, that doesn't mean that I think, if the stuff is like good in the whole because of this one performance with Bruce Dern is good, but I will defend that performance. I do think it's actually quite good.
I agree on Bruce Dern. I think he is, and I think he has the right idea. Imagine how much harder that performance would land, though, if everyone else was modulated correctly.
Yes.
If Gatsby and Nick had a personality, then Tom and the way he is so casual would land much harder. Like, you put it into words there in a good way, but I wouldn't have thought of that while watching the movie. Here's what I wrote in my notes for this, Sean. I said, there's this very limited band of expression the director allows from his actors. Everything and everyone is so stiff and narrow, so bound by the language and sequencing of the novel, even the blocking feels limited by the shape of the words. They're reading an audiobook while wearing the costumes more than they are giving performances. And that's what you were basically saying, too. And it is just, it's amazing. Because, again, these are dynamic actors. Like, it's shocking to see Sam Waterston be this boring. It's like, it feels like he's been leashed in some way. Like, not that Sam Waterston is like a fireball, but he's got passion behind his eyes in, like, Law and Order or something. Robert Redford, I think, is kind of like in some ways great casting for Gatsby. When when I read the book, I just had Robert Redford's picture in my head because I think visually he looks the part so much. But like, he's not getting to be Robert Redford here, Even if I think there are maybe more interesting pieces of casting that would be kind of off the beaten trail, Robert Redford could kill this if you let him. He's not allowed to. So the other thing with this movie, it has one of the worst sound mixes I've ever heard because it feels unfinished. It feels like a first draft of like what they got on set and through some ADR, but there's basically no ambient sound in the movie. Like, everything's very quiet. When they're at the parties, you'll get a little bit of music, and then once people start talking, they'll just drop all of that out, and it's as though they are on a closed set where no one is making noise, which is what would be happening on set, but usually then you would then go in post-production and juice that so it sounds like they are at a party. And it's basically every scene in the movie. There's so little sound going on. I found it eerie, and then you combine that with the actors doing a lot of the time these kind of like mumbled ASMR-ish like readings of the text. Like, I found the sound like made my skin crawl. I thought it was so like off and weird and unfinished in a way that like it's really rare you see a Hollywood movie where that level of ineptitude made it to the sound design. It would be finished in most movies, even bad movies.
Yeah, well, it's like, because that stuff, the filter, the really stilted acting, and then I think also just the fact that it is a period piece. Like, I kept on forgetting watching the movie that it was made in the 70s, because it feels like somehow the movie was made like 3 decades earlier. Like it like a bad movie from the 40s is what this feels like, that somehow they managed to film on color. They got some future fucking technology, but they just filmed the movie the way that like a bad movie from the 40s
you would have had 3-strip Technicolor, and the blur thing they're doing is definitely an attempt to try to replicate Technicolor. It's a bad attempt, but like the 40s is the right analog, I think, Sean.
Sure, yeah. Yes, but yeah, if it was a good movie, it would have like cool Technicolor. Oh man, can you fucking imagine fucking Gatsby's pink suit at the end of the movie with like that era of Technicolor? That would look fucking choice. Like some fucking Mary Poppins ass looking pink suit Gatsby is what I would want. Yeah, so all that stuff, I definitely agree, is very frustrating. Obviously, like for me as a teacher, I only looked at the movie for like what is a scene or like a little part of the movie I can show. So it's like, I like the production design broadly of the movie, partially because it's like, it is trying to actually look like the 1920s. And so there are like moments like that I like, that you can't use the 2013 one for, because so much of the production of that movie is very anachronistic. So if you're trying to be like, oh, and this is what these people would look like, this is like clothes these people would wear, the cars they would drive, the houses they would live in, like this movie is much closer to that, which is, again, not a thing that makes it a good movie, but it's a thing that I can show some screenshots from the movie on a slideshow and be like, and this is what this stuff would look like, to kind of picture certain elements. But there's not, I'm trying to remember, like, I feel like there's a couple of little moments I pulled from the movie for my classes, but nothing's jumping out. There's only ever stuff I pulled from, like, the very beginning as, like, stage setting of, like, looking at this little tiny clip from, like, chapter 1. But I think for me, in terms of outside of the like production stuff that is very dull and super stilted, for me, the hugest problem with the movie as like the story is when you get to the middle part of the movie, they make this very painful choice to decide to just shove in scene after scene after scene of invented scenes between Gatsby and Daisy to like sell you on their relationship. Some of the dialogue in these scenes is pulled from and adapted from other Fitzgerald short stories, which is a thing that you can do because every single Fitzgerald story is about some guy who from the West who doesn't have a lot of money falling in love with a rich socialite and it not working out. Like that's Fitzgerald wrote one book and he wrote it a lot and that's fine. But the problem is that like those scenes work in those stories from their like the books or short stories they're from Tales of the Jazz Age because those stories are about those kinds of scenes. The Great Gatsby is very deliberately and specifically not about these kinds of scenes. It's not a fucking love story. And there's no love story to be told between these two people. And so it's just, they give you, it's like 5 or 6 scenes in a row, sometimes briefly interrupted with like a little tiny thing they pull from the book of like one of the more incidental moments in the book that kind of like intersperse in there. But it's just these incredibly painful scenes that, again, you're like bad 1940s romance movie that they're just pulled straight out of something like that in terms of how they feel. And it's just like, that's the part of the movie that to me is the kind of like nails on a chalkboard equivalent, because not only is it like the kind of like, you know, really poor, like stilted, unenthusiastic, passionless acting and stuff you get and the poor directing, but it's also just like contributing nothing positive to the story and just diluting everything that is in the story, and it just kills the movie so bad once you get to the midpoint and they start shoving that shit in there.
Yeah, and Sean, so you said the thing about the production design being like period accurate, and that's true, but I think it is a bad translation of the novel in the production design and stuff. Like, because here's the thing, and this is where I will 100% defend the Luhrmann movie, is when you are adapting a book like this, the goal is not to adapt the literal word of the book. It is to try to get across the same things cinematically that the author was trying to get across verbally. And I think it is hilarious when you watch like the party scenes in the 74 Gatsby of like Gatsby's party or any of the other gatherings, how dull, lifeless, limp they are. And like, do they look probably more like what a Jazz Age party looked like than the Baz Luhrmann movie does? Yes. Do they do anything to reflect what Fitzgerald wrote in the book about these gatherings, what they were like, how they stand out from other gatherings of the time? No. And that is something where, like, being anachronistic, using Jay-Z songs, doing the kind of big, crazy camera moves, all that stuff, that is Luhrmann trying to shake the viewer into understanding it the way Fitzgerald would want that understood, of like what this party is, what this feels like, how overwhelming it is. And it is hilarious to me how completely the 74 movie whiffs on even trying to do that, trying to do anything to evoke what this was like. They're just polite social gatherings that look like business meetings or something. They're very dull and staid. You know, and I think there's lots of examples of this in literature to film adaptations where what you want isn't necessarily literal, it is experiential. Like in Lord of the Rings, for instance, it is technically unfaithful to the book that the hobbits are played by like 20-year-old actors. That is technically wrong. Frodo should look like if you're being faithful to the book, Frodo is a 50-year-old man. And Sam is a little bit younger, and Merry and Pippin are a little bit younger, but they are like middle-aged hobbits. But it would be weird in the movie if you had them be middle-aged, because you would not then have the correct contrast next to the rest of the Fellowship and the other characters they meet, who are, in fact, in some cases, older and more grizzled in their like life trajectory. And so there's a good reason for not being faithful to the literal letter there, but because by breaking that, you do get the idea of the character across more fulsomely. And that's the kind of thing that I think the 74 movie, there's no real thought put into that element of it. and this is across the whole book, of like, how do we not just read the text, but translate the text? And the thing I will give the Luhrmann movie is, even when I think it doesn't work at all, it's often taking the swings, and you can see where their brain got off the highway of like trying to figure out, we have this book, how do we take these words and make it a movie? And I at least respect there's effort put into that, and there is none in the 74 version.
Yes. Although I guess the thing I would say to that is that, like, that's not because they're trying to be faithful to the 1920s setting. That's just because the production, like, the filming is incompetent. Because it's like, because you could represent, you could have people do the fucking Charleston in a Great Gatsby movie and still have the parties be fucking crazy. You just have to film it and stage it a better way. Like, I think you could still have period accurate parties, because the parties are debaucherous as they are described in the book, because the 1920s were debaucherous. And it's fine for you to still have, like, people look like flappers, to have like period appropriate dances and things like that. I don't think that it's one or the other. I think you can do the Luhrmann approach, but I think you can also still have something that is historically accurate to, like, this actual time period which the novel is set, and try to find a way to represent that on film, just because I think that's always cool to see a window into like other time periods on film, but still be able to film it in a way that gets the emotional experience across to the viewer.
I think that's true, but I also I think the Luhrmann movie does do both. Like, I think one of the interesting things going back to it was that it does mix period accurate stuff with, like, its crazy anachronistic stuff, and, like, even in the music, it will, like, use the Charleston as the base for a hip-hop rearrangement that goes into a different direction, and I think that's interesting. I think that is a thoughtful way to try to, like, represent this. But I also do see the logic, though, of the Luhrmann thing, because he's not the only director who has done this kind of thing of saying, okay, this is set in 1920 whatever, but I'm not making the movie for people from that time. I'm making the movie for people in 2013, and I think whatever tool you have at your disposal to try to get that across to people in 2013 is what you are, that's your goal, not to, like, do what it would have exactly looked like at the time. And you are correct in that there's multiple ways to do that. My biggest problem is that the 74 version abdicates that responsibility and says we're not going to try it. The attempt is what is needed.
Yeah, I guess for me, the thing I like about trying to represent those periods more accurately is that if you do it really well, you can show the ways in which those cultural specifics are transient, but that the human experience underneath them is essential, in a way that if you're trying to change all of it, you're not thinking about the cultural specifics of that time period, because it has already been translated for you. And so I think that there's a way in which you can, and this is part of the experience of reading the book, in that the language is very archaic relative to modern, conversational English, but it gives you this window into a different time period, both in terms of historical stuff, but also just in terms of, like, the language that was spoken, the language that was used at the time. But when you get accustomed to it, you also see how, like, it is the same essential human experience. Like, humans are humans, whatever time period you're talking about. And I just think there's a way that you could do that with a movie as well. The 1974 movie did not do that.
Okay, the 74 movie doesn't do that. I do actually think the Luhrmann movie does that. I think the Luhrmann movie in the party scenes, I think, does a good job at that. I think it has a mix of it, because it is not just a completely anachronistic shit show. It is a mix of things. You do have flappers next to people doing crazier stuff. You do have, like, the modern Lana Del Rey or Florence and the Machine stuff mixed in with, like, period music. And I think all of that is interesting. The other thing that the Luhrmann movie does that is inexcusable for the 74 movie not to do is that it shows that these were racially diverse gatherings, which is correct for what speakeasies were. Like, that is a huge dynamic of speakeasies and, like, the entire Prohibition era, is that it was a period where, because liquor had to go underground, that a lot of racial and sex barriers also went underground. And there's something about the 74 movie where it's very white, it's very upper crust, does not give you that idea that, no, these were gatherings where people were breaking established social norms. And that is something the Luhrmann film, I think the Luhrmann film leans on race in somewhat awkward ways in other scenes where it uses black people sort of as props on the side of the frame. But I do think in those scenes, it's, like, super important that they included that, and I think very good, and I'm glad it's there.
It's one of the many things about the 70s movie that makes it feel like it is a much older movie than it actually is.
Yes.
Because it's like, there's no reason why you couldn't have had a diverse cast of people at these parties.
Yeah.
It's the 70s, it's not, you're not dealing with like the 1940s like studio system right now. Like you can you can do what you want with this shit. Yeah. And that stuff's very weird.
Well, and the 70s are an era where Hollywood is like integrating in interesting ways,
Yes.
because you've got new filmmakers who are not abiding by the production code, like standards on race and sex and all of that stuff. No, Sean, here's the thing. This movie, as just a film scholar, offends me in the way the Joel Schumacher Batman movies offend me, where the grammar of it, the filmmaking of it is so off, is so poor, is so bad that it makes my skin crawl. And like it's a level of bad that like you so very rarely see. But that's the kind of thing. Like the equivalent of this in text would be like a book with no punctuation and all the words misspelled. That's what it feels like to me, where it's just like, I know how movies can work. This is wrong. This is wrong to its core, and it breaks my brain a little bit to watch it.
I mean, you just basically described James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, so okay. I think it's pretty cool.
But I imagine James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake was done with purpose and intention and not incompetence. Yes. Okay.
Yes, it's supposed to be an absolutely insane novel that breaks like all language rules, basically. But yes,
or to do another high school novel, William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying does a lot of like weird things with language and like run-on sentences and stuff. And if you were to make a movie out of it, you would have to break stylistic codes in interesting ways to do that. But again, you would have to be doing that with purpose and intention.
Yes. So other things about the 1974 movie, again, I just think like in terms of the story beyond the way it's being told, just like the things in the story just die at the midpoint when they decide to shove in these just horrible fucking scenes between Robert Redford and Mia Farrow, Gatsby and Daisy. There are a bunch of like other little things they changed that leads to funny little shit. Like we talked about already, that they get rid of the whole scene where Daisy like sours on the party really hard. That leads to Gatsby saying she didn't like the party. So just Gatsby at the end of the party randomly turns to Nick and says she didn't like it very much. It's like, what? Why do you think that? That's very weird. They also get rid of all the details of Gatsby's backstory of him being James Gatz, which is a thing that like I don't think every Gatsby adaptation would critically have to give you all of that shit, Dan Cody and all of that. In fact, I think the Luhrmann movie could have cut that down and made that a little bit more sort of like implied or something. But the thing that's hilarious about the 74 movie is they do keep the dad coming back at the end. And so just out of nowhere, Gatsby's like, or Nick's like, oh, Mr. Gatsby. He goes, well, no, my name is Mr. Gatz. I'm like, that's a really weird detail to keep, but you cut out the backstory about him changing his name. If you're somebody who didn't read the book, I just have no idea how you'd even understand what that scene would be communicating. Would you be like, is this some random old man? Is this not Gatsby's dad? Like, who is this guy if his name is Gatz? It's just such a weird thing to keep one of those but not the other. That I just thought that was very funny. And then they make another thing that is just, I think is I understand why as a movie you would want to do this. The 2013 movie does some of this too. The book has Daisy basically disappear completely after she runs out of the hotel room at the end of chapter 7. So she is not present in chapter 8 or 9 at all, other than characters talking about her. But we do not see her because Nick never sees her again. And both movies insert some Daisy stuff there. And I understand the instinct for it, but I think it's one of the ways in which Daisy as a character gets collapsed in both movies, where she's a very, very ambiguous character in the book. And I think it's very fascinating that you never see her reaction to or understand her response to running over Myrtle at all. And there's a lot of like interesting discussion and analysis you can take in the book about what that means. But this movie introduces multiple scenes. It shows us the scene where Wilson goes up to Tom's house, which is described in the book, but not shown directly. And Daisy's there, and you see her freak the fuck out because obviously she has run over Myrtle. And then you also have Daisy at the very, very end confront Nick, and she kind of reiterates her line from earlier in the book of how much I'd love to see you at my table. And it's this thing of like, I understand why a movie would feel like, oh, but we've got to get Mia Farrow in the last 30 minutes or whatever. But I think it's much more powerful as a story to have Daisy exit, and then you are left chasing that Like, it's the dream. It's the thing. Like, it's like this thing that you can't have. It's gone. It's left your grasp completely. You can never have it. And I think having Daisy be absent for the ending of the story is a very particular and very specific choice that F. Scott Fitzgerald made, that I think that any adaptation probably should keep that choice.
Yes. I think, there's certain things you could defend on if you've changed the perspective of a scene in the movie, because, perspective in a film is different than a first-person narrated novel, where you might need to see Daisy, like, in the car crash scene, depending on how you depict it, that sort of thing, right? But I generally agree that, like, definitely Nick should have no more interactions with her. She needs to become a present absence, where you feel... It needs to be conspicuous that she is not there. I think, is that the right way to describe it? Like, you need to feel that she is gone. And there's different ways you could achieve that. The book achieves it in a fairly straightforward way. And the film, it is definitely the 74 one gets it wrong.
Yeah, the 74 it's much worse. Like, the scene where they have her there at the very end, where they kind of collapse a bunch of little moments together. Where you have the last meeting with Jordan, you've got that last meeting with Tom, where Nick, like, sort of says, like, hey, like, what did you tell Wilson? They sort of collapse multiple moments of the denouement there, and then put Daisy there as well. And I think it's just, like, very awkward to have that meeting. They cut out Allies, which is just a tragedy. I don't know how you do Allies. He's the best character in the book.
That's one of the best scenes in the 2013 movie, I think. They nail Allies, I thought.
Yes, although they cut out his second scene in the funeral, which confuses me. I don't know why we would keep his introduction scene, but not the payoff, where he calls Gatsby a poor bastard after he's dead. But my favorite thing about both these movies is that both of them made me fucking cackle at the end unintentionally, because it's just, I think both of them have very funny in very different ways endings. And the fucking ending of the 1974 movie is just, I can't believe that they did this. So they have the narration, right? The narration's been throughout the whole movie. It's very thudding. And at the very end, just for context, The Great Gatsby has one of the most famous, if not the most famous, endings of an American novel ever. Like, that, the last page of The Great Gatsby is incredibly famous. Like, it's just, if you're picking up any random novel, if you're doing, like, a quiz game of, like, great endings of novels as the category on Jeopardy, you're basically guaranteed that The Great Gatsby is going to be on there. That's the level of fame it has. And they give this version of the end narration, but they have Nick stop mid-sentence before you get to even the most famous line. So I'm going to read the part that Nick gives, because this is just the part that he has, and then I'll stop and then give you the rest of it. So at the end of this movie, he just goes, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him. And they go at the end. And it's like, my boy, there's a comma in that sentence. Like, how do you stop it there? It's like the most thuddingly clunky way of where they technically get some of, like, the literal point of what the ending's saying there, but it's the most just, like, growth-inducing. And because it's so famous, like, I was flabbergasted. I could not fucking believe that they stopped it there, because after he says he did not know that it was already behind him, the book continues with a comma and says, somewhere back in that vast obscurity, beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night, Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning... So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. How do you cut that out? How do you, if you're going to do, like, I don't think you should do the narration at all. If you're going to do one piece of narration, maybe you do the very ending because it's so fucking famous. But if you're going to do the narration, how do you cut out the most famous part of the ending part of the book? Like, it's just, like, that's a level of incompetence that is staggering to me. Because any random motherfucker who just took Great Gatsby in high school would tell you that you have to put that whole line in it because their teacher probably made them write a fucking paragraph about what it means.
Yeah, it's hilarious. It's great. I love it. I mean, I hate it, but I love that it's so funny that they did it. You know, the Baz Luhrmann movie has the silliness of scribbling in The Great Gatsby and then Nick reading the final paragraph with the words appearing on screen floating over the water. But you know what? A lot better than the 74 version. It's at least like a coherent, articulated ending.
So, any other thoughts on the 74 before obviously we've talked a lot about the Luhrmann one around the edges, but we can dig into it more. Any other things on the 74 before we move on?
Again, it's the kind of bad that recalibrates my sense of bad. And just going into the 2013 Great Gatsby, I never thought this was a horrible movie. Like, it's got good things about it, but I was not very excited to watch it again. But after watching that one, at least for the first hour or so, this felt like water in the desert, because it's a real movie. It has, like, real choices of camera and staging. It has actual talent behind it. It allows the actors to give performances. Some of those performances are fucking horrible, but, like, at least they're swinging for the fences. Yeah, it's like, I do think, like, the gap between these two movies is absolutely cavernous. And I say that with the caveat that I also don't think the 2013 movie is a particularly good adaptation either. I just think it is infinitely better than this one.
Yeah, well, it's like, it's an entertaining movie to watch. I mean, that's the thing you can never accuse Baz Luhrmann of, is making a boring movie, right? I mean, it's such a sort of, like, quote unquote entertaining movie to watch. It gets kind of annoying to me. Like, you know, like, I'm able to stomach Romeo plus Juliet more than this. I think this movie is
interesting.
Very extra. Again, they're basically the same movie. This one's just a little bit more obnoxious to my sensibilities, I think. But it's not dull, you know? You can't accuse the man of lacking passion about what he's making, you know? And you absolutely can. Not only can you accuse him, you can write a prescription for Jack Clayton for the 1974 movie. It's like, you need some uppers or something, bro. Like, I'm concerned for your health and safety. Some notes on The Great Gatsby 2013. It was released on May 10th, 2013. It was met with middling reviews, but it was a big box office hit, which is the same sentence I said about the previous movie. But this will show you how much different what big box office hit meant in 2013 versus 1974, because it made $350 million on a $100 million budget, which is orders of magnitude more than just what kinds of money we're talking about the last one. It's fucking weird how much the money changed.
Yeah, I had forgotten that this movie actually did well, because I think it was remembered as a flop. Because, I mean, Baz Luhrmann didn't direct anything again until 2022 with Elvis, so it was 9 years he was in movie director jail, and I don't know why. Because when you look at that, like, yeah, that is a 3.5x multiplier on the budget. That's a solid hit. I think maybe at the time they expected it would be more like a $500 million movie or something. And so maybe it, like, was thought to underperform. But I have to say, making a movie of The Great Gatsby and making $350 million is a fucking miracle. Like, you and I are weird nerds talking about it now. You would have to be an insane person to say, yes, we're going to spend $100 million on a Great Gatsby movie, because that's a surefire thing. It's a miracle that movie turned a profit.
Yes, I basically agree. And perhaps one of the reasons why it turned a profit is it did release in real D3D, because it was 2013. And you don't need me to tell you that. You could just watch the beginning of the movie and look at like the way they do the opening titles, where it like unfolds out and the snow is right in front of the camera. There's some very telltale signs of some effects that are like, yep, this is supposed to be a 3D thing, and it's a little bit annoying when it's not in 3D, because it's like just throwing shit right in front of the camera. It's not Jaws 3D. It's not that dramatic, but there's enough of that stuff. You're like, right, 2013. We did that shit.
This movie was also supported by a big soundtrack in a way that was pretty common in like the 1980s. You don't see it much anymore. Barbie from 2023 also was able to leverage this, but where it had a lot of like big artists, Jay-Z produced the soundtrack, Lana Del Rey is on it, I think Florence and the Machine have a song, and it's a mix of original songs and then existing like Jay-Z songs. There's a lot from Watch the Throne, which was the Kanye Jay-Z album from that year. And I remember, because I had the soundtrack, I listened to it, it's a great soundtrack. And it's like, that was a thing that helped propel this movie and make it feel like a big modern thing and not like, this is the book you read in high school. So that was like, from a business sense, one of the smarter things they did with this movie.
Yes, I mean, if you're going to spend $100 million making The Great Gatsby, which is just a funny thing to say, $100 million making The Great Gatsby, you got to give it the pomp and circumstance of that kind of the big kind of like the hip hop flavor they give it. It was smart, kind of the business thing they did with that. In terms of cast and crew, we've got the director, of course, is Baz Luhrmann, as I say here in my notes, the movie director with whom every English teacher has a relationship. One can only assume that potentially Jonathan, in that time period where he wasn't making things between this and Elvis, he was perhaps trying to make a movie of Vice and Men, maybe Fahrenheit 451, The Most Dangerous Game, Scarlet Letter. Who knows what like canonical high school English text that he was trying to make a movie that you just have no choice but to show at least parts of in a class about it. Because
Sean, I'm not the one assigning the monthly 10 this month, but if I was, my monthly 10 list for you would be the top 10 books you would most dread Baz Luhrmann making a movie of. And I do want an answer to at least a couple of those.
You mean you could put that in your back pocket if you can't remember another top 10 to give me? You're free to throw that my way.
All right.
You want to, crush my heart a little bit.
I'm making a list right now.
All right. In terms of screenplay, the screenplay is by Baz Luhrmann and Craig Pearce. Craig Pearce is Luhrmann's longtime writing partner who's worked on all of his movies except for the movie Australia, which is the Baz Luhrmann movie that nobody knows exists. Cinematography.
I saw it. It was recut recently as a TV miniseries called Faraway Downs. You can see it on Hulu. I've not watched that version. I saw Australia in theaters, baby.
Wow, I didn't.
Okay.
I had no idea you got so much hot Australia knowledge.
It's basically an attempt to do Australian Gone with the Wind, and that does encompass, it also has problematic racial components. So
Interesting. In terms of cinematography, we've got Simon Duggan, who he has done a wide range of movies, from the movie version of Warcraft, which is a thing I forgot had been made until I was looking at this guy's stuff. I'm like, oh, right, they made that movie. He also did Hacksaw Ridge, and then most recently, he was a cinematographer for Furiosa. So
he's great. He's a big Australian cinematographer. He's very talented.
It was edited by 3 people, Matt Villa, Jason Ballantine, and Jonathan Redmond. I never went back to put notes onto what other stuff they did, but they edited this movie. The music is by Craig Armstrong, who also did Romeo plus Juliet and Moulin Rouge, a thing that does not need to be told to you if you've seen those movies. Or at least, I haven't seen Moulin Rouge since I watched it the first time. But again, I've watched Romeo plus Juliet a lot. And it's like, it might as well be the same soundtrack. Again, they might as well be the same movie in my subconscious. There's just something that it operates on the same level. Interestingly to me, I never watched Elvis, but he did not do the soundtrack for Elvis. So I guess he went with someone else for Elvis.
Well, Elvis is mostly Elvis music. So like it doesn't have it's a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
In terms of our cast, we have Leonardo DiCaprio as Jay Gatsby. We have Spider-Man / Tobey Maguire as Nick Carraway, which this is close enough to his Spider-Man that every time he comes on screen, I just am like, it's Peter Parker. Because he always kind of has that look that he has in the Spider-Man movies when he comes into a scene and he kind of like... Yes. Looks like he doesn't quite know what's going on, which is the befuddled Peter Parker look, and it works okay for Nick, but I can't turn off the Spider-Man in my brain, so I just keep on seeing him as Spider-Man. Carey Mulligan as Daisy Buchanan, Joel Edgerton as Tom Buchanan, Elizabeth Debicki as Jordan Baker, Jason Clarke as George Wilson, and Isla Fisher as Myrtle Wilson. Both these movies have very good casts, yes. But this cast is much better used than the good cast in the other movie.
It is much better used. A couple of notes. One, I think they broke a law, like a fundamental law of creation, by putting both Joel Edgerton and Jason Clarke in the same movie. Because those are actors I always get mixed up. Yes. Jason Clarke is the bad one. Jason Clarke, he's very bad in most of what I've seen him in. Joel Edgerton is a better actor. They're both terrible here. Jason Clarke's George Wilson is an SNL performance. Like, it is so over the top, stupid, thudding dumb. And Joel Edgerton is pretty close to that at points. So, like, they're both awful. Everyone else I do think is very good. Carey Mulligan is fantastic as Daisy. She's always fantastic. Like, we didn't talk about this, how bad Mia Farrow is in the, because everyone's bad, but like, I think she's particularly bad in the 74 one. I think Carey Mulligan, like, comes at Daisy with much more empathy. The big one for me is Elizabeth Debicki as Jordan is perfect. Like, it's the best piece of casting in either of these movies, I think. This was where she was basically discovered. She's since become a pretty big actress. And she's awesome. Like, she looks the part, for one. She is tall. She is athletic. But I also think, like, she just gets the way that character is both attractive and a little off-putting because she is so kind of full of herself and dishonest. And honestly, my biggest complaint with this movie is that she drops out of the movie halfway through because that is the best illustration of a character from the book, I think, is Jordan in this movie. And then they just abandon her, and it's a fucking crime.
Yeah, and it also like hurts the Nick characterization because you lose a lot of dimensions of that character because they basically they only keep Jordan in the scenes in which she is plot essential in the book. Including some scenes that the 1974 one changed. Like, we didn't talk about this, but the 74 one changes completely how Nick and Gatsby meet in a way that's weird, where Nick is taken into the mansion by a guy with a gun under his jacket,
right.
and he meets Gatsby there, rather than this movie also can't quite do the Gatsby scene because Leonardo DiCaprio is way too famous to do it. But in the book, Nick just is talking to him for like an hour at the party, and then randomly the guy's like, "Oh, I'm Gatsby." He's like, "Oh." Which neither movie can do because they cast insanely famous people to play Jay Gatsby. So you can't really do that moment. Maybe an issue with the whole approach of how to cast Gatsby for these movies.
Well, you kind of have to cast someone famous because I think they have to have a gravitas. They have to bring something with them. But, like, then it does mean, I do think this movie gets around it in a clever way with how they depict that scene, but it does mean you cannot do the introduction where he is anonymous.
Yeah, I do think that, like, my dream casting for a Jay Gatsby would be your kind of like character actor who is not really a Hollywood leading man, but can just tip over into the Hollywood leading man type. Kind of like a younger Kyle MacLachlan or
that'd be great.
Oh God, why am I blanking on this actor's name? Boyd in Justified.
Walton Goggins? That's a great idea.
Right,
yeah.
like that can be that kind of handsome Hollywood kind of type, but whose career is very fucking weird and has mostly been used as a character actor. That's kind of who I'd have as Gatsby. Obviously, you can't do that in a big Hollywood $100 million movie where you have to sell it on the big star. But if you're doing like an indie Great Gatsby movie, that's the kind of person I would do, because you could do those scenes, and I think they could communicate the like, this guy is playing Jay Gatsby. He's not this person really.
Can Walton Goggins have the drawl, though? Can he be doing it in his voice from Justified?
When you do the backstory, you do the scene with Dan Cody. You know, you can bring out a little bit of his accent from Justified. I don't think James Gatz is supposed to be from Kentucky, but it can work either way.
Yeah.
But yes.
So okay, the other thing I wanted to say with these actors is I think DiCaprio and Maguire are both good, and I think they have good chemistry together, like, that makes me buy them as friends. Here's one issue I think this movie has. They're both too old. They're both 40-year-old men.
Yeah.
And it's a problem. And I don't know if it needed to be a problem, because, again, I think, like, DiCaprio has the right gravitas and the right kind of weirdness to him, and I think Maguire has the right kind of wide-eyed wonder where he can be an audience insert and compelling on his own terms. The problem, I think, is that this is a digitally photographed movie, and it is so sharp. Like, the cinematography is so sharpened in a way you wouldn't get on film, and you could adjust on digital, but it feels like they kind of left it on the sharpest setting, so it really emphasizes the lines in their face. You can really see that they are middle-aged men, and there's really no attempt to age them down in any meaningful way. And I think it really mutes that this is a story about young men making young men's mistakes. And I also think it creates a problem where, like, I want more Jordan, but it is also weird that Elizabeth Debicki is 25 and Tobey Maguire is 40, and when they're on screen together, I don't think they would work as a couple. So, like, there's things like that where, like, at the end of the day, one of the biggest hurdles for this movie is that even though they did cast good, capable actors, they are too old, and the movie is shot in a way that emphasizes age rather than downplaying it.
Yeah. And I will say that one of the things I think that has aged this movie a lot is just that overall aesthetic. It's partially the 3D-ness thing of it, but it's just it's so digital and artificial looking in a way that is kind of oppressive, in a way that's different than the oppressive digital look that a lot of modern, more recent, like, kind of MCU style Hollywood films look. It's just like, you know, there's just a lot of scenes in this movie where it kind of hurts my brain to look at, where it's just like none of it feels tangible, none of it feels real. And I bet some of it, like, are things that are actually on set, but it's like that are physical props or like backgrounds or whatever that aren't even that much digitally enhanced. But it's that, like, as you say, the super sharp digital aesthetic with the, like, 3D kinds of things they occasionally do to put, like, snowflakes in front of the camera and stuff, just give it this super artificial look that I think can work in some of the scenes of like the parties can be fine, but it's a failure of this movie is that any scene that does not make sense to have everything turned up to 11 just doesn't really work for me. And so it's like the movies, this is just a Baz Luhrmann thing. It's true of Romeo plus Juliet as well. Anything that's not just going full fucking bore, we're going crazy with it, like Act 3, Scene 1 in Romeo plus Juliet, where like 3 people die, or the crazy party scenes in here, or where Myrtle gets killed. Like scenes where people have to be in a room and talk to each other can become very obnoxious, and the aesthetic of the movie contributes to that to me.
Yeah, the problem with like contemporary digital photography, like the MCU syndrome, is very flat images that don't have much color grading applied, so they just look dull. That is not the problem here. This has a great color grade. I actually got the 4K disc for this because there was a sale where like you buy 2 get 1 free, and I got 2 movies I wanted and I got this. So one of those movies was Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. Much better. I had a much better time with that movie.
Yeah, great movie.
Yeah, great movie. There's kind of different ends of the spectrum, those two. But anyway, so like it's got a great HDR grade. It looks good on your OLED. Like, again, the color grade is good. The image has depth, all of that. I do think it is the sharpness that makes it look very artificial. The sharpness also has a problem in making the green screen scenes very obvious. The problem with green screen scenes now, again, is usually a color grading issue in that, like, that there's a thing where they haven't graded it enough to, like, blend the layers of the image. That's not the problem. I think there's a problem that everyone looks like they have an outline around them because the digital photography is just too sharp. And I think that needed to be, like, I know it's not a dial, but they needed to turn down the dial. Like, there's just an issue there. And to be fair, if you look at a lot of other movies from 2013, you'll get this. Roger Deakins was ahead of the curve. Like Skyfall was the same year, and Skyfall was noted for being digital, but looking like 1,000 times better than everything else. And that's actually a good comparison to this, is that you look, because they're both digitally shot, but Skyfall looks like 20 years ahead of the curve from Great Gatsby in how it like actually uses the technology in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where it made me feel very old watching this movie because it doesn't feel like this movie came out that long ago. But then when you watch it, I'm like, I don't know the last time I watched a movie that came out in 2013. And so it's in my head, movies today look exactly like movies looked like in 2013. There's not that much of a difference. You're like, oh, no, shit has changed. Style has aged. Technology has shifted. Trends have changed. And yes, we are old men, and 2013 was a long time ago.
The Hobbit movies have this exact same problem,
yes,
where everything is too sharpened and it makes things look kind of fake, even when they are real. That movie also has... The Hobbit movies had a color grading problem at the time, too, that this movie does not have. That's been fixed on the 4Ks, but boo boy. Anyway, yeah, so, yeah, the cinematography... It's a mixed bag, because you can't say it looks bad. Like, there is some astonishing images here. The production design is very good. But it is mixed. I think you're right about the scenes. Like, I remember in theaters, the scene that broke me in this one is how they depict the big blow up where they go out and Gatsby wants to reveal that there's this affair, and then Daisy has cold feet, and then he and Tom have this fight. And that scene, I think it starts out okay, where they do a good job of showing how Tom picks up on it without Gatsby sort of noticing. And I think they play that moment well. And then when they start going into the city and it just keeps getting louder and louder and louder until Leo is almost killing this guy. And I'm like, you guys are off the ranch at this point. This is so off base. This is so like out of left field. And it just gets like way too big for that scene, which is like in the book is small, tight, and uncomfortable. And here it is like histrionic. And I feel like it just went in the exact opposite direction.
Yeah, I think that that's the most kind of disastrous thing they do in the movie. And it's like there's a lot of little things they do that kind of build up to that. Because they sort of just like make little changes here and there and make little kind of like adjustments to things that just kind of change the overall mood of a lot of the relationship dynamics, particularly between Gatsby and Daisy. Where there's a lot of stuff in the movie where they really heavily lean on on Gatsby's corruption is kind of always right behind him. And there's a lot more kind of emphasis put on the fact that he's having these business dealings with Chicago and Philadelphia and all that kind of stuff. And then alongside that, they then put in this stuff of where Gatsby makes it a specific plan that he's like, we are going to, on this day, we're going to tell Tom that you have never loved him. And they create this little scene in what would be chapter 6 in the book where Daisy comes to the party and Daisy and Gatsby go off for 30 minutes alone. and you obviously don't follow them in the book because you're always from Nick's POV. In the movie, you have this little extra scene where they're making out behind the tree, and that's where they start laying out this plan, where Daisy starts getting kind of nervous about how far is this going. And that, I think, just changes the mood of that whole sequence, where Gatsby has like created this whole like dastardly scheme to try to like reveal the affair. It changes completely everything in the scene that before they go to the hotel room, where this is a moment that I actually like Mia Farrow's reading of the line in the 1974 movie, where they're at the dinner table and it's super hot and they're just talking and stuff. And then at one point, Daisy just looks over at Gatsby and says, "You're cool. You're always so cool." And it's this sort of like thing that just slips out. And that's the thing that tips off Tom. Whereas here, they play it as like Gatsby has coached her on to say this line, and that's the thing that tips off Tom, and then they go down. It just reminds me a lot of the stuff that he does in fucking with Romeo and Juliet and Romeo plus Juliet, where it's like you're way overthinking and trying to be way too clever with the text here, and you're just fucking tripping over yourself and trying to do it, because it just changes the whole feel of this. Like, in the book, it's that all of these things, the cheating, the lying, the deception, have just slowly ramped up over the course, and things have just started to turn and become sour in all the different dimensions of the book, to the point where it slowly erupts in this scene with like the heat, being this like kind of spark that triggers all of it. And then in the movie, instead, it's this just very elaborate whole sequence of her being coached and her saying the thing and then them going to the hotel room. And then it culminates in them adding in a huge number of lines that Tom has, where he just lays down more and more and more on the, "You see, you're different from us. You're a lower class and we're upper class and you can never be." And he just says it over and over again until Gatsby explodes at him and almost punches him. And then that is the thing that then we read as this is the straw that broke the camel's back, and is the thing that makes Daisy decide she can't be with Gatsby, which is weird because it now makes it feel like the problem is that Gatsby actually is lower class. That the issue with Gatsby is he is corrupt and he is violent and he is part of the lower classes, and Tom is the one who is calm and cool and composed, and Gatsby can't deal with that. And it's like, that's a weird extra twist to put on the scene, where it feels like you're kind of proving Tom's point about the class shit and his racism and all of that. You're kind of saying that he's not wrong because Gatsby does lack whatever like class these people have in the tact, which is confusing when Tom is the only person in the book who has ever hit anybody, because he fucking breaks Myrtle's nose earlier on. If you're going to add a sequence where someone almost punches someone that didn't happen in the book, presumably you'd have Tom almost hit somebody because he's the guy who's like actually extremely violent. So yeah, that whole sequence, they just make it so over the top, so extreme, try to dial everything up to 110% in order to make this, because it is the climax of the book, it's the height of the action of everything, he's trying to pump everything up to 11, and the problem is that then kind of causes everything to spin out of control, and I think the story no longer feels like it makes a lot of sense anymore. Like, the character dynamics and the character relationships have, through these changes, deviated so much from the book that I struggle to see how you can then read the ending of the book narration at the end and act as if that was the story you told, because you kind of changed it too much for that to be the ending point.
Yeah, this is just where I think Luhrmann is ultimately, even though, again, I don't want to just paint with too broad a brush, because I do think he does some things here very well. But he is also a director who is not great at modulating. Like, his movies are sort of one thing and one thing only. And this is why Moulin Rouge works. This is why Romeo plus Juliet doesn't. And this is why The Great Gatsby doesn't, is because he can do some things well, and then there's these scenes where, like, he's not capable of having the emotions come out in a not maximalistic way.
Yeah.
Because the point of that scene is very much that emotions boil over. But they boil over in a very sort of sad, internalized way, not in a, I, Leonardo DiCaprio, am now going to beat the shit out of you, Joel Edgerton kind of way, like we're on the set of, an action movie. I mean, it feels like a scene from The Departed at that point, right? Like, it's so big. Martin Scorsese, director who can modulate when he needs to. Martin Scorsese's Great Gatsby, I would enjoy seeing that. I bet he could do that. But anyway, I bet he could. Of course, he could do that. that's a stupid thing to say.
He could make most movies. It'd be hard to come up with a movie, be like, Scorsese could never do that movie.
Yeah. Anyway, now maybe that's a monthly 10 you should give me is top 10 movies Martin Scorsese couldn't do. I don't know. My Neighbor Totoro. He doesn't know how to animate.
Yeah,
that feels like a technicality, though.
Yeah, that's getting a pretty obscure list.
Anyway, but yeah, I think that's the problem you're describing, right? Is that like when it comes time to, that scene needs a different register than the party scenes. It just does, right?
Yeah, another moment that's exactly like that again causes this movie to feel like this kind of becoming pretty gross is the way they deal with Wilson as a character, where they add in this detail where he's apparently beating up Myrtle in that like scene where after he's discovered her cheating, right, and before she runs out because she sees the car, he's like shoving her up against the window and she's got a like blood dripping down her face, and it's like, what the fuck? Like it feels like you're really just sort of saying, no, these poor people, they do have these violent instincts and they do lack class. Especially because it's like, yes, we have seen Joel Edgerton smack Myrtle, but that also happens in the background of that scene because we're following, as that happens is when Tobey Maguire then starts going outside. So it's like, it is a big moment in that party scene, but it's not the focus of that scene. The way they play it, because it immediately transitions into him having this like spacey moment of like, I am both within and without. So that has happened such a long time ago that it just ends up making it feel like you're saying that, no, the classism is actually true and that the people who have money are just sort of inherently more kind of proper and noble and well-mannered, and the people who are poor are just one step away from their violent instincts. And I don't think that Baz Luhrmann is consciously trying to do that. I think it is just his maximalism in direction it inevitably leads to this outcome, and the end result feels very gross at the end of the movie.
No, it happens with everybody. Like, I think Meyer Wolfsheim is much grosser in this one than in the 74 version. He is also a bad Jewish stereotype in the 1970s one, but here, like, it is so dialed up to 11. He is so, like, grotesque, and you have that also with, like, I think, again, that Jason Clarke performance is a rough one, and it is so, like, because when he is, like, this is a detail in the book that he feels sick, but it is a sickness of, like, I feel bad because I know my wife is cheating on me. Here it's like he is this like poor wretch from like a Charles Dickens adaptation, like wandering the streets with like tattered clothes and like this crazy manner about him. And it just feels like, oh boy, you are afraid of the poor, but you've also never met a poor person. That's what that performance feels like.
Yeah, it's one of the performances I like in the 74 one, as I like Tom Wilson. As George Wilson, because there's a lot of dignity to that character in the way I feel like there's a lot of dignity to Wilson. Like, he's a good guy in the book. It's just like, he's not exciting enough for Myrtle, and Myrtle, like everybody else in that city, is chasing the wealth, and Wilson doesn't have that wealth. He believes in these sort of like, a more traditional idea of like love being the thing that would tie them together, and he's fairly naive in that way. And there's just something about, seeing him turn into this like violent, angry little man in this movie is just weird, and it makes me sad because I like Wilson. Yeah.
Well, anything else to say about this weird ass movie?
I'm looking through my notes on the different changes. We already talked about they have owl eyes in the library scene at the beginning, which I like. I like that they kept that scene, but it then bums me out. They cut out the whole denouement of the book, which makes sense. I think it makes sense to cut out some of the denouement. It bums me out that you don't have the stuff with Gatsby's father showing up and some of the details of the funeral, because I do think that whole thing of his dad being there and having the like list of here's all his like routine, and you seeing that's like how kind of amazing this young man could have been, like and that all being lost. Like, I think there's so humbling. It's one of the moments that really breaks my heart in the book is when Gats's father shows up, and you learn that Gatsby has like bought them their house and all of that. It's where you realize that like you see this other side of the character you never saw before. That's like, he's not just using this wealth he's getting through clearly like corrupt and questionable means purely for the pursuit of Daisy. He's also like using it to help people and his family. And it's like, he's a good guy. And I think that it's a shame to lose that. I kind of get the instinct of wanting to like end on a big climax moment, particularly for a Baz Luhrmann movie. But I do think that there's something pretty substantial lost in the characterization of Gatsby when you do not see that other side of it.
Here's another piece of praise I will give it, though. I think they do the scene where Nick says, you're better than the lot of them together. Mm-hmm. I like that. I think that moment lands because I do think Maguire and DiCaprio have good chemistry. I think they give it the weight it deserves, and I think Maguire reads it like just right. And I think that scene plays well. I think they do the murder of Gatsby pretty well. It's, it's over the top in the way, his stuff is over the top, but it's fine. I am still looking over my script from our high school days for my machinima, and I do think there's a scene where in my script, when Gatsby dies, Nick is at his side and Gatsby goes, "Old sport," and then dies coughing up blood. I am surprised that's not in the Baz Luhrmann movie. That feels like something he would have done. That feels like that should be in here. I also had a piece of narration where Nick is reflecting and says, "Yes, he was great, but no matter how great you are, there's always someone greater." And I do think that also feels like that should be a line in the Baz Luhrmann movie. I think he should have had me write it because I think I was on the same wavelength of stupid thudding symbolism.
Yes. Well, that actually is the thing I wanted to say, I'm glad you reminded me, is that maybe the thing that is the most grating about this movie is the way in which they edit the text for the narration, where they find ways to always cut out the deeper part of the line when they do the narration. Because the part you're talking about is about the scene where he says you're worth the whole damn bunch put together is a perfect illustration of this. Because they then have Tobey Maguire narrate after that, "I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him." And he stops there. But once again, there is a comma because he then goes on, "because I disapproved of him from beginning to end." That's the point of the fucking sentence, because that's the contradiction of Gatsby and Nick's relationship, is that he loves this man, he thinks this man is amazing, but he also thinks he is awful and terrible. He is, corrupt, he's a fool, but he's a brilliant romantic fool, right? Like, it's just infuriating to me that every time they pull a line from the book, they find some way to cut out a really important part, or they slightly change the wording in order to put the words "green light" about 3 more times into the paragraph that existed in the book, just in case you didn't understand that there's a green light on the dock, that Gatsby is reaching out to that green light as though it represents something. And it's like, I don't know how you're able to be so less subtle about this than Fitzgerald, who isn't trying to be subtle. The point of the green light isn't that it's a subtle symbol. He is very intentionally not making it subtle. But there's a difference between not making something subtle and kicking someone in the jaw with it. And Baz Luhrmann's kicking you in the jaw with the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg being the eyes of God and the green light. He actively inserts lines to that effect in narration that already exists, and then cuts out lines that are in the second half of the sentence, like that one about Gatsby and him saying, "I disapproved of him from beginning to end." He constantly is taking out like the actual substantive part of the line, and it drives me fucking nuts. And it's like, I feel bad for Tobey Maguire, because it feels like he's being commanded to like say it in this like such an over-the-top way and really put like this big spin on it, and then he's never given the actual substantive part of the line to read.
It's great. In a funny way, I do love the detail that they have Nick say the line with the green light thing of, "It was as if it was like," I forget how it's saying, he was reaching out. That's a simile. Yeah. This is a very English teacher thing, right? It is as though he is doing that, but the simile part of he's not. It is as though he's doing that. But they have Leonardo DiCaprio on set reaching his hand out towards the green light. They do that at the beginning and the end of the movie, and I fucking cackled. It's so funny because, talk about not getting subtlety. Similes are not subtle, but this is I know you can attest to this. This is like a high school English day one. What's a metaphor versus a simile? And I'm like, but Baz, buddy, it's a simile. You can just have Leo standing there looking forlorn. That's it. It ceases to be a simile. He is literally reaching out now. Yeah. It's not a simile anymore.
If all they did was at the end of the movie, they had that ghostly vision of him reaching out, that would be fine. Yes. The thing that makes it hilarious is they do the thing at the beginning when the first time that Nick ever sees Gatsby, and that's when he says, "Yeah, it is as if he was reaching out towards that green light." But they have him literally standing on a dock, reaching his hand out, and then they do a very ostentatious, gigantic camera move all the way across the bay to the green light, just to really sell the point about the green light. There's one other line reading. This is not, they don't edit this, but I was just amused by the fact that both movies, I think, kind of fail in how they deliver the last piece of narration. Obviously, the 1974 one just gets an F because they just fucking cut it off mid-sentence. But it does amuse me where it feels like either Tobey Maguire or Baz Luhrmann or someone involved didn't understand what the second to last paragraph is saying, because he says the part where it says "one fine morning" wrong. Because the book reads, "It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning," and then there's a elongated dash. That, like, the point of that is the language is enacting the idea that it is representing, right? So it's like the language is both enacting this, like, something will happen one fine morning. It's a sentence fragment. There's no verb there, right? So it's like it's reaching towards some fine morning in the distance that will never come here, because the thing that he is talking about is this vain hope that Gatsby has clung onto his whole life and clung onto his death, the same vain hope we all cling onto, which is that one day we will get those things that we want. One day we will have the wealth and the power and the youth that we desire, and it will never actually come here. And so that elongated hyphen is one fine morning, but it never comes. And it's a brilliant piece of writing. It's so good to have the grammar represent the textual idea that it's talking about. It's a great piece of writing. But then Tobey Maguire reads it as, "It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning." And he puts a period there. I'm like, nope, not an F, but a B.
You want one more detail from my stupid Halo script?
I would love one more detail from the machinima Great Gatsby we never made.
So you know how in the Baz Luhrmann movie, it has, Jay physically attack Tom in that scene where they're fighting over Daisy and have him literally fight over Daisy. Here's how I wrote the equivalent version of the scene in my script, Sean. Let's see. Tom, Daisy, it's time you choose between the two of us, me or him. Daisy, I can't. Gatsby, I know how to settle this. Gatsby removes a battle rifle and begins to fire at Tom, who jumps out of the way. And then they go on. They eventually get energy swords out and are having a fight. And then Daisy runs into the street and gets run over by a warthog, because this is Halo. I do have to say, it's eerie how many parallels there are between me as a dumb 16-year-old and the script for the Baz Luhrmann $100 million Hollywood movie, in terms of the take this nuanced book and make it dumb and obvious. It is very funny how many parallels there are.
I mean, that's because I had forgotten about the last thing of the frame narrative where Nick has his whole manuscript. Because obviously, right, we did talk about this, but they have this whole like frame narrative where they make Nick like F. Scott Fitzgerald. They add some of Fitzgerald's own history to Nick that didn't exist in the book, where he's a failed writer. And he's written out that whole story, and then he puts it all together in the manuscript. It says Gatsby in type print on it, and he looks at it and thinks for a second, and he takes out a little fountain pen and writes in cursive the great above it. I cackled so hard because it's too. Like, this literally is a joke. We might have, I don't know if it's in your script, but we might have made that joke to each other during fucking lunchtime in high school. Because yes. it is exactly the jokes we would make about like a terrible movie adaptation of the book. Oh yeah, and then at the end, Nick puts together his thing, and then it says Gatsby on the end, and he stops and he goes, "You know what? No, you were the great Gatsby." And then that would be the ending of the book. Like, I just couldn't believe it because I somehow blocked that out from my fucking memory. Again, I haven't taught this book for like 4 or 5 years. And so I haven't seen the movie since then. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't hallucinate that. That wasn't a dream. That wasn't a joke Jonathan and I made at one point when we were 16. No, that is actually the ending of a movie they paid a man gave a man $100 million budget to make. And that's what he chose to fucking end it on.
It's fantastic. It's so silly. And it is like, because Sean, when you and I were making these things, it wasn't supposed to be serious. Like, my script is stupid, but it was supposed to be. We did the same thing with The Grapes of Wrath. We were kind of taking the piss out of it. And it's the kind of thing we would have put in there. But this is supposed to be like your earnest, big Hollywood adaptation. And it does feel, I mean, it's only tonally degrees off from Mel Brooks, like in terms of being silly. And I kind of love it. I kind of, in a way where like I had a fun time watching it for those things, because I had a good long laugh at, oh, it says Gatsby, the Great Gatsby. The end.
It's just, yeah. I mean, I'm with you that, like, you know, you can't help but laugh at it. I mean, you know, it's again, it's nothing if not entertaining. I mean, it's like I said in my notes here. Baz Luhrmann is a movie director with whom every English teacher has a fraught relationship. It is not that I dislike his stuff. Like Romeo plus Juliet, there's some great scenes in that movie. And man, that's a great movie to show some scenes from. Act 1, Scene 5, where they see each other across the room with the fucking aquarium in the middle. Mwah, perfect. A great version of Act 1, Scene 5 on screen. I like his Act 3, Scene 1 okay, with where all the people die, and then it gets weirdly similar to Great Gatsby, where you have Romeo or Leonardo DiCaprio in a car, and he chases down Tybalt, and there's a very similar shot where in this movie, when you get him janking the wheel when Myrtle gets run over, I'm like, if you just de-aged Leonardo DiCaprio, that'd just be a shot from that scene, Romeo plus Juliet. But so there are moments in the movie, and there are scenes in this one that I like, right? Like those party scenes are really good. There's some of the scenes between Gatsby and Nick I think are quite good. But when you don't just watch isolated scenes and you sit down to watch the whole thing, it very much is like eating an entire bowl of candy. And you regret it by the end, even if you enjoyed yourself along the way.
Did you know, Sean, I learned about this when I was at a used DVD store the other day, and I found this in a pile of used discs, and I didn't buy it because I didn't care enough. But did you know there was an A&E TV adaptation of The Great Gatsby with Paul Rudd as Nick?
No, what?
Yes.
I did not
know this was from 2000, March 2000. I guess it was a BBC adaptation, and it aired on A&E here. It's 90 minutes long. That actually is a good thing. That's the other thing. Both of these Great Gatsby movies are way too long. This is not a book that needs a 2.5-hour movie, by God. But yeah, it has Paul Rudd as Nick, Toby Stephens as Gatsby, Mira Sorvino as Daisy, Martin Donovan as Tom. That's actually kind of good casting. And some other people I don't recognize. But yes, it was shot in Montreal, Quebec. I don't know if that's the right place to shoot The Great Gatsby, but that's pretty funny.
But, you know, it's where they shot The X-Files, you know?
Yeah. It has a 27% on Rotten Tomatoes.
The New York Times missed it as flat-footed.
Yes. There is also a new Broadway stage musical adaptation of The Great Gatsby that started Broadway. Oh, it did open on Broadway last year in April. So there is a Broadway musical. It goes to intermission on a song called My Green Light. Oh my God. It's when Daisy and Gatsby get together and they sing a song called My Green Light. Fucking, you know what? Subtlety is dead. We buried it. I'm done.
So if there's anything that's depressing about all this, it's that I'm just learning that we should be rich people. Because again, we could have come up with that ends with Gatsby and then he writes the great end. And we could have come up with that Daisy and Gatsby have a duet in a Gatsby musical called My Green Light. That's a thing that we would fucking write when we were 16. How come we're not rich? I'm upset.
Act 2. Wolfsheim reflects about illicit acts and secrecy in a song called Shady. Guys, you've got to understand. You've got to learn. Is this like a secret? Is anti-Semitism something people don't know about anymore? That you don't have a character named Meyer Wolfsheim do a big song called Shady, that is bad. That is in fact a bad thing to do. No, bad musical, bad.
That's fucking funny. Oh my God. Shady by your anti-Semitic stereotype. Nobody thought better.
Yeah, but what are we doing next time? You gave us the idea for Gatsby this month, so I thought I would come up with next month's topic, Sean, and I am suggesting that because we have a new Doom game coming out, Doom: The Dark Ages, that we finally do an episode on Doom. Not that newfangled Doom, the Doom all the kids are playing, but actual Doom. The Doom you play on your PC or your toaster or wherever else you get your video games. The original Doom and its original sequel, Doom 2. I want to talk about the real Doom.
I wanted to talk about the real Doom also, Jonathan, which is why I offered a suggestion for you when you talked about this topic. That, you know, there's a video game that's simply called Doom, but there is also a movie that's just called Doom. And it's got The Rock in it, when he was just called The Rock.